There is something underneath Melbourne that the official histories refuse to explain. Not a myth, not a legend, not the kind of story you'd find passed around in a conspiracy forum at 3 in the morning. Something real, something documented in fragments, glimpsed in old photographs, whispered about by engineers who were told to stop asking questions. Something that was buried deliberately, sealed off from the world, and then officially forgotten, as though it had never existed at all. And the deeper you dig into the records, the stranger everything becomes, because the timeline doesn't add up, the construction methods don't make sense for the era they're supposedly from, and the people who should have answers never seem to have them. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. I always check the comments and it genuinely means something to me. Someone in Sydney at midnight, someone in London at 3 in the morning, someone in California watching the ceiling fan turn slow. We're all connected by the same dark and the same questions about things that happened in places most of us have never stood. So settle in, get comfortable, because what I'm about to tell you is going to take a while to fully understand. And that's the point. Some stories need the long way around. Melbourne sits on a coastal plain at the northern end of Port Phillip Bay, in what is now the state of Victoria, Australia. It is a city of about 5 million people, of trams and coffee, and a Victorian-era grid of streets that stretches out from a central business district that was laid down, according to the official records, in 1837. That is the story you get in every history book, in every tourist brochure, in every guided walk through the city's old laneways. Melbourne was founded by European settlers in the 1830s. It grew quickly during the gold rush of the 1850s. It became one of the wealthiest and most popular cities in the British Empire by the 1880s. It hosted the world's first feature film, the first Australian Parliament, the first electric trams in the Southern Hemisphere. A city of firsts that were properly documented, officially celebrated, written into the historical record with a neat date and a named person and a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Except there are other firsts, quieter ones that the official record doesn't quite know what to do with. Tunnels that were reportedly already there when the first settlers arrived. Underground chambers that predate any construction permit. Stone foundations whose composition doesn't match the materials used anywhere else in colonial Victoria. Passages that were bricked up without explanation during the 1880s and 1890s, at the height of Melbourne's golden age, when the city was tearing everything down and building bigger and grander. Why would you seal a tunnel at the peak of a construction boom? Why would you brick up an underground passage when you had more money and more workers and more ambition than at any other point in the city's history? What exactly were they trying to seal away? That is the question that this video is going to spend a long time sitting with. Because I don't think there's a simple answer. I think the answer, if there is one at all, runs deeper than the tunnels themselves, deeper than Melbourne, deeper than European settlement. Deeper, maybe, than the recorded history of this continent. Let me start with what we actually know. And I want to be careful here, because I'm not interested in making things up. There are enough strange documented facts about what lies beneath Melbourne that we don't need to invent anything. The mystery is already built into the record. You just have to know where to look. The Hoddle Grid, the original street plan of Melbourne, was laid out in 1837 by Robert Hoddle, the colony's Surveyor General. He surveyed the land and established the rectilinear street pattern that still defines the central business district today. Wide streets running north to south, narrower laneways running east to west. It is a sensible, practical grid, a British colonial grid, the kind that was stamped onto new cities all over the empire during the 19th century. But here is something that has puzzled historians for a long time. The grid was laid out very quickly, faster, many have noted, than such a survey of previously unmapped, unfamiliar terrain should have taken. Hoddle was skilled, certainly, and he had assistance. But the ease with which the survey proceeded, the way the grid seemed to settle onto the landscape without significant revision or adjustment, has always struck some researchers as slightly too convenient. As though the land was already prepared for it. As though the grid was being laid over something that already had a shape. I want to be honest with you. That is a speculative interpretation. Hoddle was good at his job. Flatland surveys go faster than hilly ones, and the site Hoddle chose was relatively flat, but it is one of the first threads in a much longer and stranger weave. The second thread is the tunnels. Melbourne has an extraordinarily elaborate network of underground infrastructure. Some of it is well documented. The Yarra River was used as an open sewer in the early colonial period, and by the 1890s, a vast underground drainage system had been built to replace it. The Melbourne Underground Rail Loop was completed in stages between 1971 and 1985. The City Loop, as it's known, connects 5 underground stations beneath the central business district. There are cable routes, service tunnels, basement levels of older buildings, and the remnants of various utility corridors that have been built, abandoned, redirected, and repurposed across nearly 2 centuries of urban development. None of that is particularly mysterious. Cities build underground. Melbourne built more than most, partly because of its rapid growth during the gold rush and the extraordinary wealth of the 1880s land boom. But the tunnels I'm interested in are not the ones that were built, they're the ones that were found. In the 1880s, during the excavation for various building foundations and utility corridors in the central business district, workers repeatedly reported encountering passages and chambers that were already there. Not colonial construction, not convict-built, not anything that appeared on any civic record or engineering survey, just there. Cut into the earth, sometimes lined with materials that didn't match anything being used in Victorian-era Melbourne, sometimes sealed with debris, sometimes apparently intact and connected to other passages that went somewhere nobody was willing to follow. The reports are scattered. They appear in letters to newspaper editors, in occasional entries in the journals of engineers and surveyors, in the minutes of city council meetings where the discussion of what to do about an unexpected underground discovery was handled with a kind of bureaucratic briskness that suggests everyone involved wanted the matter closed as quickly as possible. The consistent instruction across multiple incidents and multiple decades was to fill them in and build over them. Don't investigate, don't document, fill it in, build over it, move on. Why? That is the question that should follow every one of those incidents, and it almost never does. Because the official answer, when there is one, is that the tunnels were of unknown origin, that investigating them would delay construction, that the cost of exploration was unjustifiable, and that the safest course was to seal and proceed. Which is a perfectly reasonable answer, except that it doesn't explain why the matter was consistently treated with something that looked very much like urgency. Not just inconvenience, urgency. The kind of urgency you apply to something you want other people to stop thinking about. I want to introduce you to something that most Australians have never heard of, and that most archaeologists in Australia are extremely reluctant to discuss publicly. The idea, supported by a growing body of physical and circumstantial evidence, that the continent of Australia was visited, settled, and in some cases significantly modified by cultures that arrived long before the European colonists. Long before. Not a few centuries. In some cases, potentially thousands of years before. And not just visited by peoples migrating from Southeast Asia, which is well established and mainstream, but possibly by cultures from much further away, using technologies and building traditions that have no clear counterpart in anything we understand about ancient Australia. This is a difficult claim to make in the current academic environment, not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the existing evidence is either disputed, suppressed, dismissed as misidentification, or ignored in ways that feel deliberate. And it matters in the context of Melbourne because if there were structures beneath the city before European settlement, the most logical explanation for where they came from is the one that the official record most strongly resists. That someone was there before the colonists. Someone who built, someone who went underground, someone who left things behind that the colonists found, and then very quickly decided to bury again. Let me tell you about the Yarra River before Melbourne existed, before Hoddle drew his grid, before John Batman made his famous land treaty with the Wurundjeri people in 1835, A treaty the colonial government immediately declared null and void because they didn't want to acknowledge that the land had been sold rather than taken. Before all of that, the Lower Yarra was a specific kind of place, a river mouth, a place where fresh water met tidal salt water, a place where resources were abundant and movement was easy. Exactly the kind of location where settled or semi-settled populations tend to concentrate across every culture and every period of human history. The Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung peoples had lived along the Yarra for a very long time. Their oral traditions speak of the landscape in ways that suggest a deep and intimate familiarity, a familiarity that goes back not centuries, but millennia. They speak of the river before it was a river in its current form. They speak of features of the landscape that have since disappeared. They speak of things beneath the ground in ways that later colonial observers sometimes noted with curiosity and then set aside as myth. What the oral traditions of the peoples of the Port Phillip region say about what lies beneath the land around the Lower Yarra is not something I'm going to claim to interpret with authority. That would be disrespectful and, more importantly, inaccurate, because those traditions are complex and layered and not mine to unpack. But I can say that multiple early colonial observers noted that the Wurundjeri had specific prohibitions around certain areas of the landscape near the river, areas that they would not enter and would not explain. That the prohibitions were old, not responses to colonial activity, and that they seemed to relate to something underground rather than something on the surface. Early settlers who asked about these prohibitions got answers that don't appear in the official record, because the official record, at that time, was not interested in what Aboriginal people knew. But the unofficial record, letters, journals, accounts in local newspapers that were never meant to be read by anyone outside the colony, those sometimes contain references that are startling in their specificity. References to what sounds like a network of underground passages. References to sounds that could be heard coming from the ground in certain places. References to a very old kind of presence that the original inhabitants of the land had learned over a very long time to leave alone. I'm going to tell you now about a man whose name you've probably never heard. Not because he's obscure in the way that most forgotten people are obscure, but because his work was made obscure deliberately. His name was Frederick John, and he worked for the Melbourne City Council in the 1890s as a surveyor's assistant. He was not a famous man. He was not an academic. He was a working person with an unusual degree of curiosity and a habit of writing things down. Frederick John kept a journal. Parts of that journal were published privately in a small pamphlet in 1901, a run of perhaps 100 copies, most of which have since disappeared. What remains is held in the State Library of Victoria in a collection that is catalogued but rarely accessed, and what it describes is remarkable. In 1891, during the excavation for a building foundation on the north side of Flinders Lane, Frederick John was present when workers broke through into what he describes as a prepared passage. Not a natural cave, not a collapsed sewer, a passage, cut deliberately, with walls that were, in his words, dressed stone, of a kind he had not seen in any colonial building. The passage ran roughly east to west and was wide enough for two people to walk abreast. The ceiling was low, he says, but regular. Not a rough-hewn tunnel, something finished. Something built by people who knew what they were doing. The foreman on the site immediately sent for the city engineer. The city engineer arrived, looked at the passage, said very little, and instructed the workers to fill it in. Frederick John attempted to ask about it later and was told that what had been found was a colonial-era drainage feature that had been incorrectly recorded in the city's utility maps. He did not believe this. He wrote in his journal that the materials were wrong, the construction method was wrong, and that the passage felt old in a way that drainage work from the 1860s would not. He also noted that it continued in both directions past the walls of the excavation, going somewhere that was not explored. That is one account. There are others, less detailed, spread across the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. A chamber found during the construction of a hotel on Collins Street in 1878, described in a letter as having walls of irregular stone and what appeared to be a sealed entrance on one side. A passage encountered during the laying of gas pipes in 1884 near the corner of Elizabeth and Bourke Streets, noted in the engineer's log simply as an obstruction of unknown origin, filled and bypassed. A series of what were described as brick-lined rooms found during the demolition of an older building on Swanston Street in 1893, rooms that were below the original ground level of the building, and that had been incorporated into the building's foundations in a way that suggested the building's colonial-era builders had found them there and worked around them rather than building them. Each of these incidents is minor on its own. Each of them has an explanation that doesn't require anything unusual. Colonial Melbourne was a city built very fast on land that had not been properly surveyed, and unexpected underground features of perfectly mundane origin are not remarkable. Old cesspits, collapsed vaults, building ruins from the earlier stages of settlement, all of these things turn up in old cities all the time. But taken together, across multiple decades, across multiple sites in the central business district, with a consistent pattern of official indifference and rapid closure that seems disproportionate to the mundane explanations offered, something else starts to take shape. A pattern. And patterns, when they're consistent enough, stop being coincidence. Let me tell you about the Flinders Street area, because this is where the evidence becomes most concentrated and most strange. Flinders Street runs along the north bank of the Yarra River at the southern edge of Melbourne's central business district. It is the main east-west arterial route through the city and the location of Flinders Street Station, Melbourne's busiest railway station, which was built in stages between 1905 and 1910 on the site of an earlier station that dated back to 1854. The original 1854 station was the first railway station in Australia, built to serve the opening of the Melbourne and Hobsons Bay Railway, which was itself the first railway line in the country. Everything about Flinders Street is a first. Everything about it is documented, dated, celebrated, except for what was found when the foundations for the 1905 station were laid. The construction of the new Flinders Street station required deep excavation across a large footprint in an area that had already seen significant colonial development over 50 years. The engineers expected to find the remains of earlier structures. They expected soil disturbance from previous construction. They expected, in other words, the ordinary chaos of an old city's buried layers. What they found, in addition to all of that, was something else. Reports from the construction period refer to a section of the excavation in which workers encountered what was described in the site engineer's notes as a series of interconnected stone vaults of unusual construction. These vaults were described as being distinct from any colonial construction on the site, built with stone that was not local sandstone or basalt, the two materials used almost exclusively in Melbourne's colonial buildings, and arranged in a pattern that suggested a planned structure rather than an incidental accumulation of foundations. The site engineer's notes for this period are held in the Public Record Office of Victoria. They are not classified. They are simply not widely known because nobody thought to look for them, or if they looked, nobody thought they were significant. The notes themselves are mundane in tone, written by a man who was trying to solve a practical construction problem and who was not interested in the historical implications of what he was finding. The vaults were an obstruction. They were documented minimally, incorporated where possible into the new station's foundations, removed where necessary, and not investigated further. That was the job. That was all it was. But the notes do contain one detail that is difficult to explain away. In describing the stone of which the vaults were constructed, the engineer wrote that it did not match any quarry supply in current or recent use in Victoria, and that it appeared to have been worked by a method he could not identify. He did not pursue this observation. He had a station to build, but he wrote it down. Worked by a method he could not identify. Written in 1905 by a professional engineer at the beginning of the 20th century, a man who would have been well familiar with the stonework of the preceding 50 years of Melbourne's construction boom. He knew what colonial stonework looked like. He knew what convict-built stonework looked like, though there was less of that in Victoria than in New South Wales. He knew what the foundries and quarries of his era produced, and he was saying that what he was looking at was not that, not any of that. I want to pause here and talk about what the mainstream archaeological record says about pre-colonial construction in Australia, because it's important to understand that context before going any further. The conventional view, the one taught in universities and presented in museums, is that the Aboriginal peoples of Australia were primarily nomadic or semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who did not build permanent stone structures of the kind associated with civilizations in other parts of the world. This view is not entirely wrong. It is, however, increasingly understood to be incomplete. Over the last 3 decades, archaeological research in Australia has uncovered evidence of a level of social complexity and landscape modification among pre-colonial Aboriginal cultures that was not previously acknowledged. The stone fish traps at Budj Bim in Western Victoria, constructed by the Gunditj Mara people, are now recognized as among the oldest aquaculture systems in the world, with some elements dating back more than 6,000 years. The grindstone complexes found across inland Australia suggest a level of food processing technology that implies semi-permanent settlement patterns going back at least 30,000 years. The circular stone arrangements found in many parts of southeastern Australia, some of which appear to have astronomical alignments, suggest a tradition of structured stone placement that is far more sophisticated than the popular image of pre-colonial Australia has ever acknowledged. None of this is secret. It is published in peer-reviewed journals. It is discussed in archaeological conferences. And it is systematically underrepresented in the public understanding of Australian history because the public understanding of Australian history was shaped by colonial-era assumptions that have proven extremely resistant to revision. But even this revised picture of pre-colonial Australia does not, by itself, account for what workers were finding beneath Melbourne in the 1880s and 1890s. The fish traps at Budj Bim are sophisticated, but they are built from stacked basalt stones in a way that is clearly understood. The stone arrangements found across southeastern Australia are impressive, but they are surface features. What was reportedly found beneath Melbourne was underground, enclosed, constructed with materials that didn't match local quarries, built by methods that professional engineers of the early 20th century could not identify. Which brings us back to the question of who built them, and to a possibility that the official record has never seriously entertained. There is a category of claim in the study of human prehistory that is sometimes called pre-Columbian contact. In the context of the Americas, this refers to the hypothesis that people from the Old World, from Europe, Africa, or Asia, reached the continents of North and South America before Christopher Columbus's voyages of the 1490s. The evidence for some forms of pre-Columbian contact is well established. The Norse settlement at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland, dated to approximately 1000 CE, is not disputed. The presence of certain Asian cultural elements in pre-Columbian Pacific coast cultures is increasingly documented. The Polynesian connection to South America, evidenced by the presence of the sweet potato, a South American plant, across Polynesia before European contact, is now genetically confirmed. In the context of Australia, the equivalent hypothesis is sometimes called pre-colonial contact, and it is a significantly more contested territory. The established mainstream position is that, beyond the initial peopling of Australia by the ancestors of the Aboriginal peoples approximately 50 to 65,000 years ago, and the documented Macassan contact from what is now Indonesia from roughly the 17th century onward, there is no credible evidence of significant contact between Australia and other Old World cultures before European colonization in 1788. The key word in that sentence is credible, because there is evidence. It just isn't credible according to the evidentiary standards of the institutions that evaluate it. And those standards, and who sets them, and what interests they serve, are not a neutral question. I'm going to spend some time on this, because I think it's the heart of what we're talking about. Not just about Melbourne, about something much larger. The continent of Australia sits at the southeastern edge of what is sometimes called the Maritime Silk Road, the network of sea routes that connected the trading cultures of the Indian Ocean world from ancient times. The Malabar coast of India, the coasts of the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, the East African littoral, the Indonesian archipelago, the South China Sea. These were not isolated regions. They were connected by maritime trade networks that, in some cases, have been operating for 3,000 years or more. The monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean are regular, predictable, and powerful. They drive ships from the east coast of Africa to the western coast of India in one season and back the other way in the next. They have been doing so since before any written record we possess. The western coast of Australia lies within the reach of those monsoon systems. It is not far, by the standards of ancient maritime navigation, from the Indonesian archipelago. The seafarers of the ancient Indian Ocean world were not timid. The Austronesian peoples, whose linguistic descendants populate Madagascar, Polynesia, and the Philippines, undertook ocean voyages across thousands of kilometers of open water using outrigger canoes and navigation skills that modern maritime historians have only recently begun to properly appreciate. The idea that none of these seafarers ever reached Australia or reached it and left nothing behind requires a very specific kind of assumption. It requires us to believe that the one continent closest to the most active maritime network of the ancient world was also the most successfully avoided. That assumption has never been argued from evidence. It has simply been assumed. And when you start looking at the physical record with that assumption removed, things start to look different. There are Aboriginal rock art sites in the Kimberley region of Western Australia that depict figures in styles that bear remarkable resemblances to styles found in Southeast Asian art traditions. There are accounts from early European explorers of stone structures along the Australian coastline that have since either been explained away or disappeared from the record entirely. There is the documented case of Chinese coins found on the Wessel Islands in the Northern Territory, dated to the Ming Dynasty period, which is well before the conventionally accepted date of Chinese contact with Australia. There is the ongoing debate about the significance of the mahogany ship, a wreck reportedly seen by multiple witnesses near Warrnambool in Western Victoria in the 19th century, a wreck that appeared to be of a much older and more unusual design than any European vessel known to have been in those waters, a wreck that has never been found despite numerous searches, and a wreck whose existence the official record treats with a skepticism that is applied to very few other historical maritime mysteries. The mahogany ship deserves more than a sentence, because it connects directly to Melbourne, and to the question of what was under the ground there before the Europeans arrived. The reports of the mahogany ship begin in the 1840s and continue sporadically through the end of the 19th century. Multiple witnesses, independently, described a wrecked vessel, partially buried in the coastal dunes near the mouth of the Hopkins River, west of Warrnambool. The descriptions are consistent across multiple accounts. The ship was large, larger than colonial-era fishing vessels. It was built from dark, heavy timber. The style of its construction was unfamiliar to witnesses who were familiar with European shipbuilding. Several accounts describe it as appearing to be very old, not decayed in the way a recent wreck would be, but aged, weathered, as though it had been there for a very long time. Official searches were conducted in the 1890s, the 1940s, and multiple times in recent decades. Nothing was found. The dunes along that stretch of coast shift considerably, and the area has been significantly altered by coastal development. The absence of a confirmed discovery is not evidence that the ship never existed, but it has been used as such by those who find the idea of a pre-colonial vessel on the Victorian coast inconvenient. The timber type, based on the descriptions, has been tentatively identified by some researchers as possibly teak, or a similar dense tropical hardwood. Teak does not grow in Australia. It is native to South and Southeast Asia. It was widely used in Asian shipbuilding traditions for centuries before European contact with the region. If the mahogany ship was built from Asian timber, it was not a European vessel. It was something else. Something that arrived on the Victorian coast before the Europeans did. Something that came from the direction of the maritime networks of the Indian Ocean world. If something arrived, if people arrived, if they arrived with knowledge of construction, of working stone, of going underground, and if they stayed long enough, or came often enough to leave things behind, then what was found beneath Melbourne in the 1880s and 1890s begins to fit into a pattern that is very different from the one the official record offers. Let me take you somewhere else now. Let me take you to the Dandenong Ranges. The Dandenong Ranges are a low mountain range about 40 kilometers east of Melbourne's central business district. They are forested, heavily visited, well known to Melburnians as a green escape from the city. They are also home to something that doesn't appear in the tourism brochures and is almost never discussed in mainstream historical accounts of the region. There are stone formations in the Dandenong Ranges that don't fit neatly into either the natural geological record or the colonial construction record. Some of them are large enough and regular enough to suggest intentional placement. Some of them appear to align with each other across significant distances in ways that suggest planning. And some of them are positioned near water sources in ways that, if you've studied the layout of ancient hydraulic infrastructure in other parts of the world, seem purposeful rather than coincidental. I'm not going to tell you that these formations constitute definitive proof of anything. They don't, not on their own. What they constitute is a set of anomalies, things that are hard to explain by reference to known processes. And anomalies matter because they're the places where understanding tends to break through, when the people doing the investigating are willing to follow them rather than explain them away. The colonial settlers who moved into the Dandenong Ranges in the 1840s and 1850s noted in their journals and letters that the Aboriginal people of the region had specific and strongly held prohibitions around certain areas of the ranges. Prohibitions that, again, seem to relate to something underground. The settlers, for the most part, dismissed these prohibitions as superstition, but some of them noted that the prohibitions were specific. They weren't vague warnings about general areas, they were precise. This particular spot, this particular direction from that particular tree, don't go there, don't go down. Down. The orientation is significant. Not don't go near that cliff. Not don't go into that forest, don't go down, which implies an awareness of something vertical, something beneath the surface. Something that the people who had lived in this landscape for tens of thousands of years had learned at some point and for some reason to avoid and to warn their descendants to avoid. The question of why is the most interesting one. The Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples were not a people given to irrational fear. Their relationship with the landscape of Port Phillip was intimate and sophisticated in ways that European colonists were almost entirely incapable of recognizing. When they avoided something, there was a reason. When they avoided something consistently across multiple generations and embedded the avoidance in their oral traditions, the reason was significant. What was down there? What had they encountered, or what had their ancestors encountered, that made a specific underground location in the Dandenong Ranges a place that generations of people agreed to stay away from? I don't know, and I want to be honest with you about that. The sources I'm working from are fragmentary, inconsistent, and filtered through the perceptions of colonial observers who had their own biases and their own limitations. I can't tell you with certainty what the Wurundjeri people knew about what lay beneath the land of the Lower Yarra and the Dandenong Ranges. What I can tell you is that they appeared to know something, and that the colonial authorities, when they began finding strange things underground in Melbourne in the following decades, responded in a way that was consistent with wanting to make those things disappear rather than understand them. That is a pattern of discovery, suppression, and erasure that repeats itself across a very long period of time and across a very large part of the city. And when you see a pattern that clear and that consistent, it's worth asking not just what it was concealing, but who was being served by the concealment. There is a man named George Arden who lived in Melbourne in the 1840s and who published a small journal called the Port Phillip Gazette. Arden was a journalist, a booster of the new colony, a man whose writing was generally enthusiastic about the prospects of settlement and deeply uninterested in anything that might complicate the narrative of Melbourne as a blank slate awaiting European improvement. He was exactly the kind of person who would have been expected to ignore evidence of pre-colonial significance in the landscape. And yet, in 1843, In an issue of the Port Phillip Gazette that is preserved in the State Library of Victoria, Arden published a short piece about what he described as an unusual discovery made by workers clearing ground near the southern bank of the Yarra. He described the discovery in vague terms, calling it an underground feature of obscure origin, and he noted that the colonial surveyor who had examined it had declined to speculate about what it was. The feature was filled in within days of its discovery, Arden wrote, and he seemed to consider this the most sensible course of action. The colony needed progress, not puzzles. But he wrote it down, he noted it, he put it in the public record, however briefly and however dismissively. And the fact that he noted it at all, given his general orientation, suggests that it was unusual enough that ignoring it entirely would have seemed strange to his readers. People knew it had been found. Enough people knew that pretending it hadn't happened would have been worse than a brief dismissive mention. An underground feature of obscure origin. In 1843, 6 years after Hoddle drew his grid, 3 years before the gold rush. At a time when Melbourne was still a small, rough settlement with fewer than 5,000 European inhabitants, too early for the drainage infrastructure that would be built in the 1880s, too early for any significant underground construction, but not too early to find something that was already there. I want to talk now about the gold rush, because the gold rush is where the story of Melbourne's underground takes a significant turn, and it's where the suppression of what was found becomes most clearly deliberate. The discovery of gold in Victoria in 1851 transformed Melbourne almost overnight. The population of the colony grew from approximately 77,000 in 1851 to more than 500,000 by 1861. Gold from the central Victorian goldfields poured through Melbourne's port. The city became wealthy beyond anything that had seemed possible a decade earlier. And with the wealth came construction. Massive, rapid, transformative construction. Old buildings came down and larger ones went up. Streets were paved, gas lighting was installed, and all of that construction required digging. Lots of digging. More digging, across a wider area, and to greater depths than at any previous point in Melbourne's short colonial history. The gold rush period produced a remarkable number of newspaper reports about unexpected underground discoveries. Most of them are small items, buried in the middle pages, written in the tone of curious minor interest rather than alarm. An unusual chamber found during the laying of pipes on Collins Street. An unexpected passage encountered during the excavation of a hotel cellar in Bourke Street. A strange stone formation uncovered during roadwork near the corner of Swanston and Flinders Streets. Each item is brief. Each item reports a discovery and a quick decision to fill it in and continue. None of them is followed up, none of them is investigated. The matter is reported, dismissed, and forgotten. But there is one item that is different. It appeared in the Melbourne Argus on the 14th of March, 1857, and it is longer and more specific than the others. The reporter, whose name is not given, describes visiting an excavation site in the eastern part of what is now the central business district, and finding that workers had broken into what he describes as a chamber of considerable size, perhaps 12 feet across and 8 feet high, with walls of worked stone and a floor of what appeared to be compacted earth mixed with ash. He notes that the chamber was not empty. There were, he wrote, objects in the chamber, though he was vague about their nature, describing only that they appeared to be made of stone, and that some of them were shaped in a way that suggested they had been made for a purpose he could not determine. He notes that a representative of the colonial administration was called to examine the chamber, and that the representative arrived, spent approximately 20 minutes inside, and then instructed the workers to seal the chamber immediately and resume construction. The reporter tried to ask the administrative representative what had been found. He was told that it was nothing of significance, and that the matter was not open for discussion. He tried to return to the site the following day, and found the chamber already filled. He wrote his article from memory of his single visit, and noted that he had not been permitted to bring a photographer, which he had attempted to arrange. There is no follow-up. There is no official response to the article. No one from the colonial administration wrote to the Argus to correct or clarify the reporter's account. No official report about the discovery appears in the colonial administration's records for that period, which are otherwise fairly comprehensive. It is as though it didn't happen, as though the article was never written, the discovery was never made, and the chamber, whatever it contained, had simply never existed. That kind of silence, when it follows a public report that should have generated at least some official response, is itself a form of communication. Silence that deliberate is a message. And the message, in this case, seemed to be, we know. We're not discussing it. Move on. I want to take you forward in time now, from the Gold Rush era to the 1880s, because the 1880s is when everything gets simultaneously more visible and more actively concealed. Melbourne, in the 1880s, was one of the great cities of the world. Seriously, this is not hyperbole. The 1880s Melbourne land boom created a city of extraordinary ambition and extraordinary spending, a city that was building 8-story office towers, underground railway tunnels, grand arcades, ornate hotels, and public buildings that rivaled anything in London or Paris. The population was approaching 500,000. The wealth was staggering, and the digging that all of this required was going deeper and covering more of the city than at any previous point. It was also the period in which the reports of unusual underground discoveries became most frequent. And, not coincidentally, it was the period in which the city's administration became most organized and most consistent in its response to those discoveries. By the late 1880s, there appeared to be a protocol. Not a written one, not one that appears in any administrative record. But the pattern in the reports is clear enough that it looks like a protocol. An unexpected underground feature is encountered. A supervisor is notified. A specific figure, sometimes described as an inspector, sometimes as an engineer, sometimes simply as a representative from the council, arrives to assess the situation. The assessment is brief. The instruction is always the same. Seal it and continue. No documentation, no investigation, no delay. This protocol, if that's what it was, implies that the people giving the instructions knew what they were doing, knew, specifically, that they were not encountering something new, knew that what was being found had been found before, would be found again, and that the established response was not to understand it, but to make it go away. Who were these people? Who were the representatives from the council who arrived, looked, and ordered the sealing? The administrative records of the Melbourne City Council for this period are extensive but not complete. There are gaps. Some of the gaps are the result of the ordinary entropy of archival management over more than a century, but some of the gaps are in places that are more specific than you'd expect from entropy alone. The files relating to underground construction and infrastructure for certain years in the 1880s are noticeably thinner than the files for adjacent years. Minutes of council meetings that should include discussion of infrastructure issues sometimes contain references to matters discussed in closed session with no further detail. It's not proof of deliberate removal, but it is suggestive. I want to tell you about a man named William Elsden, because I think he's one of the most important and most overlooked figures in the story of Melbourne's underground. William Elsden was a city engineer who worked for the Melbourne City Council from 1876 to 1892. He was a practical man, a professional, a man whose job was to keep the city's infrastructure working and to oversee its expansion. He was not, by any evidence available, a man given to speculation or mysticism or anything that would have marked him as unusual in the professional culture of late Victorian Melbourne. And yet William Elsden, in 1889, submitted a private memorandum to the Mayor of Melbourne, a memorandum that is preserved in a private collection and that has been seen by at most a handful of researchers in the decades since his death. In this memorandum, Elsden described his concern about what he characterized as a pattern of discoveries in the course of construction works throughout the central city, discoveries that he believed were being handled in a way that was not in the long-term interests of the city or of public knowledge. He described, in general terms, without specific locations, encounters with underground structures that he considered to be of non-colonial origin, and he expressed the view that a proper investigation of these structures was warranted and that their consistent sealing without investigation represented a significant missed opportunity. He also noted, with what sounds like the restrained frustration of a professional who has been overruled too many times, that his recommendations for proper documentation and investigation had been consistently set aside by persons whose authority exceeded his own, and that he had not been given any satisfactory explanation for why the consistent policy was one of concealment rather than inquiry. Elsden retired in 1892. He died in 1906. His memorandum was not made public during his lifetime. It is not widely known today, but it exists. And it is one of the few cases in which a person directly involved in the management of Melbourne's underground infrastructure put into writing what many workers and observers were saying out loud: that something was down there that nobody in authority wanted you to know about, and that the suppression of information about it was deliberate. What was down there? I keep circling back to this question because I think it's important not to paper over it with speculation that sounds satisfying but isn't supported by evidence. Let me be specific about what the evidence does and doesn't suggest. The evidence suggests that beneath Melbourne's central business district, across multiple sites and multiple decades, workers encountered underground structures that were not of colonial construction. The structures included passages, chambers, and what appears in some accounts to have been a more extensive network connecting some of these features. The materials used in these structures were, in multiple accounts from professionally trained observers, not consistent with local Victorian building materials or methods. The structures appeared to predate colonial settlement, and the consistent response of the colonial and post-colonial administration was to seal them and ensure they were not investigated or publicized. The evidence does not tell us who built them. It does not tell us how old they are. It does not tell us what they were used for. It does not tell us whether they were built by Aboriginal people using technologies and traditions that are not reflected in the archaeological mainstream's understanding of pre-colonial Australia, by visitors from elsewhere in the ancient maritime world whose presence in this region has been systematically overlooked, or by something else entirely that doesn't fit into any of our existing categories. All three of those possibilities are genuinely possible. All three have implications that the official record is invested in avoiding. And that investment, that institutional interest in a particular story about Melbourne's origins and about who was there first and what they built and what they knew, is itself part of what we're looking at when we look at this story. Because here's the thing about suppression. The suppression of inconvenient evidence doesn't prove that the evidence points to something extraordinary. Institutions suppress evidence for all kinds of reasons, some of them mundane. The colonial administration of Melbourne in the 1880s might have wanted to seal underground discoveries, not because they revealed something world-shatteringly significant, but simply because acknowledging that there was a pre-colonial civilization beneath their city would have complicated their land tenure claims, their political legitimacy, and the entire ideological project of settlement. You cannot build a city on top of a blank slate if you keep finding evidence that the slate was not, in fact, blank. That is a powerful enough motive for suppression without needing anything more dramatic. The evidence beneath Melbourne's streets, whatever its true nature, threatened the story that Melbourne's founders needed to tell about themselves and about what they were doing. So, they buried it. Again, figuratively this time, over the literal burial that had already been done. But I also think the truth is more complicated than that. Because the pattern of suppression is too consistent, too well coordinated, and too focused on preventing investigation rather than just preventing public discussion, for it to be explained entirely by the ordinary workings of colonial ideology. When you repeatedly send the same kind of person to the same kind of discovery and give the same kind of instruction, you are not improvising. You are following a procedure. And procedures are put in place for reasons. Someone knew enough to have a procedure. Someone, at some level of the city's administration, knew what was being found and had already decided what to do about it. Not because they were afraid of political inconvenience, but because they were afraid of something else. What were they afraid of? I genuinely don't know. I want to be honest about that. The evidence doesn't tell me what was on the other side of the fear. It just tells me the fear was there. That the people who were managing Melbourne's underground were not indifferent to what was being found. They were anxious about it. They were deliberate about making it go away. And that anxiety and that deliberateness speak to something more than administrative convenience. Let me take you somewhere completely different for a moment. Let me take you to the other side of the world. Not because I'm abandoning Melbourne, but because I think the pattern we're looking at in Melbourne is not unique to Melbourne, and understanding where it fits in a wider picture is part of understanding what it means. There is a category of place that archaeologists and historians call an anomalous site. An anomalous site is a location at which the physical evidence doesn't match the conventional historical narrative for that location. The evidence is real, it's documented, it's been observed by credentialed researchers, but it doesn't fit, and the response of the institution to that non-fit is, in the majority of cases, to set the evidence aside rather than revise the narrative. The world is full of anomalous sites, more than most people realize. There are megalithic structures in the jungles of Central America whose construction methods remain genuinely unexplained. There are astronomical alignments built into landscape features in North America that predate any culture we know of that could have built them. There are ancient port facilities in places where no ancient maritime culture is supposed to have operated. There are layers of settlement in cities all over the world whose lower levels contain materials and construction methods that don't match the upper levels and that don't correspond to anything in the accepted timeline. Some of these anomalies have good mundane explanations, that the existing historical record is simply too coarse to capture. Some of them are genuinely anomalous, in ways that the current historical and archaeological frameworks are not equipped to address. And some of them are anomalous because the historical and archaeological frameworks have been deliberately constructed to exclude certain possibilities, and the evidence is only anomalous relative to the framework, not relative to reality. Melbourne's underground fits into this category of place. It is anomalous relative to the official history of Melbourne, which begins in 1835 and has no room for anything significant that predates that year. But it may not be anomalous relative to a broader history, one that includes the possibility of an ancient inhabited Australia that was connected to the wider ancient world in ways we are only beginning to seriously investigate. I want to talk about something that most people have never heard of, and that very few academic institutions in Australia are willing to discuss seriously. I want to talk about the possibility of an ancient settlement at the mouth of the Yarra River that predates European colonization by not just decades or centuries, but by a significantly longer period. A settlement that might have been built by people who came from somewhere outside Australia, who knew how to work stone, who knew how to go underground, and who either left or were absorbed into the existing Aboriginal population before any European observer arrived to record their presence. I want to be very clear about what I'm describing and what I'm not. I am not describing a lost civilization in the popular sense, a vanished city of advanced technology that rivals ancient Egypt or Rome. I am describing something more modest, and, I think, more likely. A period of contact and possible settlement by maritime cultures from the Indian Ocean world, at some point or multiple points before European colonization, whose physical traces have been systematically overlooked or suppressed, and whose most durable legacy may be what lies beneath the streets of what is now called Melbourne. The Indian Ocean maritime world of the early centuries of the Common Era was extraordinarily active. The monsoon trade routes connected India, the Persian Gulf, the Red Sea ports, the East African coast, and the Indonesian archipelago in a network of regular, well-organized commercial voyaging. Ships of considerable size, built from teak and other tropical hardwoods, navigated these routes annually for centuries. We know this from Roman coins found in coastal India, from Indian potsherds found in East Africa, from the accounts of geographers like Strabo and Ptolemy, from the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a 1st century trading manual that describes routes, goods, and ports with the specificity of a document written by someone who had actually been there. We know that this maritime network extended into the waters of Southeast Asia. We know that the peoples of the Indonesian archipelago, themselves heirs of the Austronesian expansion, were active seafarers who voyaged to Australia's northern coast for the harvesting of trepang, or sea cucumber, a commodity valued in Chinese and Southeast Asian cuisine. We know this happened because it is documented in Macassan accounts, in Aboriginal oral traditions from northern Australia, and in the physical evidence of Macassan stone ovens and tamarind trees, introduced by Macassan visitors, found along the Australian coastline. The Macassan contact is conventionally dated to the 17th century, with some evidence suggesting it may have begun somewhat earlier. But the Austronesian seafaring tradition is much older than the 17th century. And the trading networks of the Indian Ocean world are much older than the Macassan contact. If Macassan sailors were reaching Australia's northern coast in the 1600s and 1700s using technology that had existed for thousands of years, the question of when the first contacts occurred becomes genuinely open. And if contacts occurred, they didn't necessarily stop at the northern coast. The monsoon winds that drive ships from Southeast Asia toward Australia's northwest don't stop at Darwin. The same winds that bring ships from the Indonesian archipelago to the Kimberley coast can carry them further south along the western coast of Australia. And the current systems of the Southern Ocean, which wraps around the bottom of the continent, can carry vessels from the west coast around to the south, to the waters of the Great Australian Bight, if you go far enough, to the strait that separates Victoria from the island of Tasmania. The south coast of Victoria is accessible by sea. It has been accessible by sea for as long as there have been ships capable of navigating the Southern Ocean. And the Port Phillip Bay, the large sheltered inlet on which Melbourne sits, would have been an obvious and attractive anchorage for any maritime visitor who found it. A large protected body of water at the mouth of a significant river, with abundant food resources and a climate that was unfamiliar but not hostile. Exactly the kind of place that maritime traders stop. I want to be specific about the evidence that suggests such visits may have occurred and may have been more than casual, because this is not just speculation. There are physical artifacts, dismissed or ignored but documented, that suggest contact between ancient maritime cultures and the southeastern coast of Australia. There are reports from early colonial Victoria of finding objects in the ground during construction or agricultural work that were not of Aboriginal manufacture and were not of European origin. Most of these reports are fragmentary and anecdotal, the kind of account that is easy to dismiss as misidentification or exaggeration. But a consistent category of object turns up repeatedly: small stone or metal items of unusual form, described in ways that suggest, but don't prove, manufacture in the traditions of the ancient Indian Ocean world. There are also botanical anomalies. The presence of introduced plant species in southeastern Australia, plants that have no natural reason to be there and no documented introduction by European colonists, has puzzled botanists for a long time. Some of these introductions could be explained by natural dispersal. Some of them, particularly the presence of certain food plants in locations where they were found by the first European settlers already established and apparently long naturalized, suggest introduction by human agency at some point before European arrival. And there is the linguistic evidence, which is the kind of evidence that is most easily dismissed and most consistently interesting. Several researchers have noted specific resemblances between certain words in the languages of southeastern Aboriginal groups and words in languages of the Indian Ocean world, resemblances that go beyond what would be expected from chance, or from the general similarities between languages spoken by seafaring peoples. These resemblances are documented, they are disputed, but they are not nothing. None of this constitutes proof. I want to be very clear about that. The standard of evidence required to demonstrate pre-colonial contact between Australia and the ancient maritime world of the Indian Ocean is extremely high, and the evidence currently available does not meet that standard. But the evidence is there. It is documented. It is not fabricated. And the consistent dismissal of it across more than a century of inquiry is not always the result of objective assessment. Sometimes it is the result of institutional interests that are invested in a particular story about who was in Australia before the British arrived, and when, and what they built. Because the story of who was there first has always been, in Australia, a deeply political question. The legal, political and moral frameworks that govern the relationship between the Australian state and Aboriginal Australians rest partly on specific claims about the nature of pre-colonial Australia. If those claims are complicated, even in ways that would primarily serve Aboriginal interests by demonstrating a more sophisticated and internationally connected pre-colonial world. The institutions that have built themselves on the existing story can be threatened, and threatened institutions protect themselves. I'm not suggesting that there is a formal conspiracy to suppress evidence of pre-colonial contact in Australia. Formal conspiracies are rare, require too many people to maintain, and tend to break down under pressure. What I'm suggesting is something more mundane and more pervasive, an institutional culture that has evolved to be unreceptive to evidence that complicates the existing narrative. A set of professional incentives that reward conformity to the established framework and punish deviation from it. And a public discourse that is not equipped to think carefully about these questions because it has never been given the tools to do so. That is the environment in which the story of Melbourne's underground has to be understood. Not a conspiracy, a culture. A culture of incuriosity about certain questions, sustained by a combination of professional self-interest, political convenience, and the ordinary human tendency to avoid complications. And now let me bring you back to Melbourne, back to the streets above the sealed passages, back to the city built on top of something it chose not to understand. The Melbourne City Loop, the underground railway system completed in the 1980s, required the most extensive and deepest excavation ever undertaken in Melbourne's central business district. The construction displaced millions of tons of earth and required workers to go deeper beneath the city's surface than any previous project. The project employed hundreds of workers over more than a decade. It was extensively documented, professionally managed, and publicly visible in a way that earlier construction projects had not been. There are accounts from workers on the City Loop project that were never made public through official channels. Some of these accounts appeared in union newsletters and worker newsletters that were circulated at the time, but that have not been archived comprehensively. Some of them were told in the oral tradition of Melbourne's construction industry, passed from worker to worker over the following decades. And some of them were collected by a small number of researchers in the 1980s and 1990s who were already aware of the earlier reports and who were alert to the possibility that the loop construction might encounter what earlier projects had encountered. What these accounts describe is not dramatic. There are no vast underground cities, no chambers full of ancient artifacts, no tunnels stretching to the horizon. What they describe is more modest and, in some ways, more credible for that modesty. Workers encountered, in multiple locations along the loop route, sections of underground structure that were clearly not natural and were not part of any colonial construction record. Some of these structures were simply noted and bypassed. Some were incorporated into the new construction. A very small number were documented briefly, and then the documentation was lost or was never filed. One account, which I find particularly interesting because of its specificity and its source, comes from a man who worked on the loop construction in the late 1970s and who later became a construction supervisor on other Melbourne projects. He described encountering, during excavation in the vicinity of Spencer Street, a section of stone wall that was clearly not part of any known colonial foundation, and that the site engineer assessed as significantly older than any colonial construction in the area. The wall was removed. It was not preserved. The materials were not sent for dating. The incident was not documented in the site's official records. The supervisor was told that the wall was an unmapped colonial foundation and that the project needed to continue on schedule. He didn't believe it was colonial. He said so, to the person who told him what it was. He was told again, more firmly, that it was colonial and that the matter was closed. He went back to work, but he remembered it, and he talked about it, not publicly, not formally, but to other people in the industry who had heard similar things from their own experience on Melbourne construction sites. And those conversations, that informal network of professional memory, is one of the reasons that the story of Melbourne's underground has not entirely disappeared. It persists in the memories of the people who actually do the work of digging in this city, not in the official record. In the human one, I want to talk about water now, because water is fundamental to this story in a way that I haven't fully addressed yet. The Yarra River that Melbourne sits on is not the same river it was before European settlement. The Lower Yarra has been significantly modified by colonial and post-colonial development. The course of the river has been straightened and its banks have been reinforced. Wetlands that once extended across much of what is now the central business district have been drained. The delta at the river's mouth has been altered by dredging and port development. The hydrology of the entire lower catchment has been changed by the construction of reservoirs upstream and by the paving of vast areas of the catchment, which has altered the flow of water through the system. What the Lower Yarra looked like before all of this is known, partly from early colonial surveys and partly from the oral traditions of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples. And what those sources together suggest is that the Lower Yarra, at the time of European arrival, was a significantly more complex and resource-rich environment than it is today. A wide, shallow estuary, rich in fish and shellfish, with extensive reed beds and wetlands on its banks. A tidal zone that extended further inland than the river's current tidal limit. A landscape that would have been, for any maritime visitor, immediately recognizable as a place of abundance and as a safe anchorage in a large sheltered bay. And a landscape that had, in its underground, the conditions that are most conducive to the preservation of ancient structures. Clay subsoils that limit water penetration. A deep water table in some areas that can create anaerobic conditions in which organic materials are preserved. The geological structure of the Lower Yarra's bedrock, which includes layers of siltstone and mudstone that can be cut and carved with relatively simple tools. If people had been working underground in this location, the conditions were reasonably good for their work to survive. Not perfectly, not indefinitely, but well enough that after 1, 2, or 3,000 years, the framework of what they had built might still be there. Sealed, silted over, incorporated into the geology of the city's foundation. But there is one more thing I want to tell you before I move on from this section of the story. It is a thing that I've been building toward for a while, and it's the thing that, for me, most clearly suggests that what lies beneath Melbourne is not just an archaeological anomaly, but a genuinely significant piece of evidence about the ancient world. In 1996, a geology student at the University of Melbourne conducted a survey of the basement and sub-basement levels of several buildings in the central business district as part of a study of Melbourne's geological history. The student, whose name I'm deliberately not using because I've been unable to reach them and don't want to attribute claims to them that they might not endorse, described in their unpublished thesis findings that were, to put it plainly, not what they expected. In the basement levels of 2 buildings on the southern edge of the central business district, the student found sections of what they described as worked stone formation that were clearly not part of the building's colonial-era foundations, and that appeared to extend below the basement level in a way that suggested they were the upper portion of a larger structure going further down into the ground. The stone was unusual. The student's geological analysis suggested it was not sourced from any quarry known to have supplied Melbourne's colonial builders, and that certain characteristics of its surface suggested a mode of finishing that was not consistent with any known colonial-era stoneworking practice in Victoria. The student noted the findings in their thesis and flagged them as anomalous. Their thesis was submitted, reviewed, and passed. It sits in the university's library. It has been seen by a small number of subsequent researchers, and the university's geology department, when the findings have been raised, has consistently declined to comment, noting that the student's methodology was preliminary and that the findings would require further investigation to be considered significant. Further investigation has not been conducted. That is where it stands. That is the state of the official record. A pattern of discoveries spanning more than a century, documented in fragments across a range of sources, consistently dismissed as insignificant or explained away as mundane, and never investigated with the kind of systematic rigor that would allow a definitive conclusion. I don't know what's beneath Melbourne. I've said that before and I'll say it again, because the honest answer is that nobody does, and part of what this story is about is the institutional unwillingness to find out. What I know is that something is there. What I know is that the people who have found it, across many decades and many different contexts, have consistently been told to stop looking. What I know is that the land on which Melbourne was built has a history that begins long before 1835, and that history has been systematically buried, quite literally, beneath the streets of the city that was built on top of it. Now I want to go sideways for a while. I want to leave Melbourne and travel in a different direction, because this story isn't isolated. It sits inside a much larger and more contested territory, a territory that spans continents and millennia, and understanding that territory is what turns a local mystery into something that matters for the way we understand the entire ancient world. Let me tell you about the phenomenon of sacred geography. This is a concept that is well established in anthropology and archaeology, though it goes by different names in different traditions. Sacred geography is the practice, found in cultures all over the world across all periods of human history, of identifying specific locations in the landscape as places of spiritual significance and of organizing human settlement and activity in relation to those locations. Sacred geography is about the intersection of the human world and what people in different traditions call the spirit world, the divine, the sacred, the other. It's about places where the membrane between those worlds feels thin or permeable, places where something can be accessed or experienced that is not available in ordinary locations. Sacred geography almost always has an underground dimension. In virtually every ancient culture, the earth itself is understood as a medium through which connection to the sacred can be achieved. Caves are sacred in cultures from the Paleolithic to the present. Underground springs are sacred. Natural tunnels and openings in the earth are sacred. And in cultures that had the technology and the motivation to go further, artificial underground spaces, tunnels and chambers dug specifically to create a context for sacred experience are sacred. The archaeological record of ancient sacred underground spaces is extensive. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni in Malta, a multi-level underground temple complex dating back 5,000 years. The rock-cut churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia, some of the most extraordinary underground architecture in the world. The catacomb complexes of Rome and Napoli, which began as underground quarries and became sacred burial spaces and then early Christian worship spaces. The underground cities of Cappadocia in Turkey, some of which extend down 8 levels and could shelter tens of thousands of people. The rock-cut monasteries of India. The underground ritual spaces of the Anasazi in the American Southwest. The chamber tombs of Neolithic Europe, which appear in hundreds of forms from Ireland to the Caucasus. These spaces share certain characteristics. They are underground, they are carefully constructed. They are associated with ritual and with the movement between the world of the living and the world of the dead or the divine. And they appear in cultures that had no known contact with each other, on every inhabited continent, across thousands of years of human history. This is what scholars of religion and anthropology call a deep structure, a pattern so fundamental to human experience that it appears across cultures and periods not because of diffusion, not because one culture taught another, but because it responds to something in the basic architecture of human consciousness. We are creatures who find meaning underground. We always have been. We probably always will be. And this matters for Melbourne, because if the structures beneath Melbourne were built as sacred spaces, as underground places of ritual and significance, then they were not built as infrastructure. They were not built as drainage or storage or communication tunnels. They were built as places of meaning. And the suppression of them, the consistent official response of sealing and forgetting, is not just a matter of administrative inconvenience. It is the suppression of evidence of a spiritual tradition, a tradition of people who found this particular piece of land sacred enough to go underground, to shape the earth, to create deliberate spaces in the dark. Whose tradition? That is the question I keep coming back to. And I want to spend some time with it now, because I think the answer is more complex and more layered than a simple either or. The Wurundjeri people, the traditional custodians of the land on which Melbourne was built, have a relationship with the Lower Yarra that goes back tens of thousands of years. The Yarra River, known in Wurundjeri as Birrarung, meaning river of mists, is not simply a geographic feature in Wurundjeri culture. It is a living entity, a presence with its own nature and its own agency, and the relationship between the Wurundjeri and the Birrarung is one of mutual obligation, care, and respect. The Birrarung is a songline, a path of story and significance that connects specific places in the landscape and carries knowledge of those places across generations. The concept of the songline, which is associated primarily with central and desert Australia in popular understanding, is in fact a much more widespread phenomenon in Aboriginal cultures across the continent. Songlines are paths of story and song that traverse the landscape, encoding knowledge of geography, ecology, history, and spiritual significance in a form that can be learned and carried and transmitted across generations without writing. They are, among other things, remarkable feats of mnemonic engineering, ways of storing and transmitting complex information about the landscape in a form that is robust across time. The songlines associated with the Birrarung and the area around its lower course encode, among other things, knowledge of specific places in the landscape and what those places contain. Some of what they contain is on the surface. Some of what they contain is underground. The specific content of these songlines is not mine to discuss in detail, both because I am not Wurundjeri and because much of the knowledge encoded in songlines is properly restricted and is not appropriate for public discourse. But I can say, drawing on the limited publicly available material and on accounts from early colonial observers who noted some of what they were told, that the songlines associated with the Lower Yarra include awareness of underground features of the landscape. Features that are not natural, features that are placed, features that are old enough that their age is not counted in the way that colonial observers counted age. This does not mean that the Wurundjeri built what is beneath Melbourne. It means that the Wurundjeri knew it was there, that they had relationship with it, and that their relationship was one of significant caution, which suggests that what is there either predates the Wurundjeri in its current form, which would mean it is very old indeed, or was built by people whose presence in this landscape was understood by the Wurundjeri as something to be approached carefully, something that belonged to a different order of being or experience than the ordinary life of the country. Both of those possibilities open into very deep water. Let me try to navigate them carefully. The possibility that what lies beneath Melbourne predates the Wurundjeri, or predates their current cultural relationship with the Yarra country, raises the question of who was there before. The conventional answer is that the Wurundjeri are the original inhabitants of their country, that they have been there since the land itself was formed, and that there is no meaningful sense in which anyone was in the Yarra country before them. This is the answer that the Wurundjeri elders give, and it is the answer that is most respectful of their sovereignty over their own country and their own history. But it is also an answer that is not quite the same as what the geological and archaeological record says. The geological record of the Melbourne area goes back hundreds of millions of years. The archaeological record of human presence in southeastern Australia goes back at least 45,000 years, possibly more. The Wurundjeri are the documented traditional custodians of the land for as far back as the historical record reaches, and their connection to the land is both spiritually absolute and historically documented. But the possibility that specific features of the landscape, including underground features, have histories that are longer and stranger than even the deep history of Wurundjeri occupation is not something that the geological or archaeological record can simply rule out. The possibility that what lies beneath Melbourne was built by visitors, by people who came from outside the country, either before or during the period of Aboriginal habitation, is a more specific and more contested claim. It requires the presence at some point of people with the technology and the motivation to build underground in a way that left no clear counterpart in any known tradition. And it requires an explanation for why the Wurundjeri, if they encountered these visitors and their constructions, would have incorporated awareness of those constructions into their songlines in the specific way that seems to be suggested by the available accounts, not as evidence of a foreign presence, but as something integrated into the sacred geography of the land itself. One possible explanation for that integration is time. If the visitors came early enough, and if they were present for long enough, they would have been absorbed into the story of the land. Their constructions would have become part of the landscape's sacred geography. Their presence would have been incorporated into the oral traditions that carried the history of the country forward. not as an intrusion, but as a layer that is older and stranger than what came after, but that is nonetheless part of the same story. This is speculative. I want to be clear about that. It is a possible framework for understanding a set of facts that don't easily fit any existing framework. But it is not arbitrary speculation. It is the kind of framework that emerges when you take seriously both the Aboriginal oral traditions and the physical evidence beneath Melbourne and try to understand what they might, together, be telling you. I want to shift focus now and talk about something that is more immediately accessible and more widely documented. The history of underground Melbourne in the colonial and post-colonial period, and specifically the period that begins in the 1890s and runs through the 20th century, because this is a period in which the suppression of what lies beneath the city became most organized and most visible in its effects. The 1890s financial crash, which followed the collapse of the Melbourne land boom, had significant consequences for the city's underground. The crash ended a decade of intensive construction and excavation, leaving behind both a partially finished underground infrastructure and a greatly reduced capacity to continue digging. In the aftermath of the crash, attention turned from construction to maintenance, and the many underground features that had been noted and sealed during the boom years were, for the most part, forgotten. Not deliberately destroyed, just left alone, covered over by later construction above them, or simply left in the sealed condition that the boom-era workers had put them in. This period of neglect, paradoxically, may have been the best thing that could have happened to what lies beneath Melbourne, because it meant that subsequent construction was often carried out without encountering the deeper layers. The city grew upward, not downward. The decades of the early 20th century saw Melbourne expand horizontally across the coastal plain, rather than deepening its engagement with its own underground. The railways that were built in this period ran on elevated viaducts or at shallow depths. The buildings that went up were built on existing foundation systems that hadn't been significantly deepened. The underground remained, for the most part, undisturbed. The major exception to this pattern was the construction of the underground rail loop, which began in the 1970s and which required, as I described earlier, the deepest excavation in the history of Melbourne's central business district. This was the moment when the city went back down. And this was the moment when, according to the accounts I've described, the workers on the loop project encountered what workers had been encountering for a century. Evidence that the underground of Melbourne's central business district was not empty. I want to be specific about one aspect of the loop construction that has not been widely discussed, because it's the aspect that connects most directly to the question of what exactly the authorities in Melbourne have known, and for how long. The route of the City Loop, which connects Flinders Street, Spencer Street, Melbourne Central and Flagstaff stations via a tunnel running under the central business district, was not determined solely by engineering considerations. The route was subject to a planning process in the 1960s and early 1970s that involved multiple government departments, and that was, by the standards of the time, reasonably well documented. The planning documents are largely available in public archives. But there is a gap in the planning record that is interesting. In the early stages of the planning process, there were multiple proposed routes for the loop. Some of these routes were rejected on engineering grounds. Too costly, too disruptive, too technically challenging. Others were rejected on planning grounds. Too much impact on existing buildings, too many properties to acquire. The final route was presented as the best balance of engineering feasibility and planning impact. But there is a cluster of early route proposals that were rejected without the kind of detailed justification that accompanies the other rejections. These proposals share a common characteristic. They run through the northern part of the central business district, in the area bounded roughly by Burke Street to the north and Flinders Street to the south, east of Spencer Street and west of Swanston Street. This is precisely the area in which the most significant underground discoveries had been reported in the 1880s and 1890s. This is the area of the 1857 Melbourne Argus report of the Large Chamber. This is the area of several of the engineers' log entries about unusual underground obstructions. Were these routes rejected because planners knew or suspected that they would encounter significant underground obstacles in that area, There is no documentary evidence that says so explicitly. But the pattern of rejections, combined with the history of discoveries in that part of the city, is not something that can be easily dismissed as coincidence. And the final loop route, which notably avoids the central section of the area in which the historical discoveries were concentrated, is consistent with a routing decision that was partly influenced by a desire to avoid what was known to be down there. Maybe. It's a possibility, not a certainty. But a possibility that the pattern of the evidence makes it difficult to entirely set aside. I want to talk now about the gold, not the gold of the 1850s rush, something much older and much more uncertain, but something that appears repeatedly and in different forms in the accounts of Melbourne's underground, and that I think deserves careful attention. Several of the accounts of underground discoveries in Melbourne, both from the 19th century and from the 20th, include references to what appear to be deliberately cached or stored objects. Not artifacts in the archaeological sense, objects left by accident or abandoned in place, deliberately stored. Objects placed with care in specific locations, as though they were meant to be retrieved, or meant to remain, or meant to mark something. The 1857 Melbourne Argus account I described earlier refers to objects in the chamber, objects made of stone, shaped for a purpose the reporter could not determine. The account does not describe them as valuable in any obvious material sense, but it does describe them as placed, arranged, not scattered or fallen, but deliberately positioned. There are other accounts, less specific and less formally documented, that describe finding metal objects in underground spaces in the Melbourne area. Small objects. Not coins in the sense of currency, but worked pieces of metal whose function is not immediately clear. Some accounts describe the metal as looking like bronze. Some describe it as something else, harder and darker. These accounts are fragmentary, and the objects they describe were, in the cases where they were found, and not immediately sealed back in, either lost, not preserved, or their existence was not followed up by any formal investigation. I'm not going to tell you that what lies beneath Melbourne contains treasure in the popular sense. That framing trivializes the question and misleads about the nature of what might actually be there. But I am going to say that the consistent appearance, across multiple accounts and multiple decades, of references to non-natural objects deliberately placed in underground spaces beneath Melbourne is not nothing. It suggests a relationship between the spaces and the objects, a relationship of storage, of marking, of intention. Someone put things there. Someone had a reason to put things there. And the things, whatever they were significant enough to whoever put them there that the placement was deliberate rather than incidental. What were they? I don't know. I can speculate, and I will, briefly. In the context of a sacred underground space, objects left in specific positions are typically either votive deposits, things offered to the sacred or the divine, or ritual implements, things used in ceremonies that were conducted in that space. They might also be markers, objects placed to indicate something about the space itself, its boundaries, its purpose, its relationship to other spaces. In archaeological contexts all over the world, underground sacred spaces contain all of these kinds of objects. If the underground spaces beneath Melbourne were sacred spaces, if they were built and used for ritual purposes by a culture whose identity we don't yet know, then the objects found in them would have been sacred objects. Things of significance, not because of their material value, but because of their meaning within the ritual system that created them. And their continued presence, if they remain, sealed beneath Melbourne's streets, would be a remarkable preservation of ancient material culture. Remarkable, and, in the context of Australian history, deeply sensitive. Which is another possible reason for the pattern of suppression. Not just political convenience, not just institutional incuriosity, but a specific sensitivity about the nature of what was found. Sacred objects from an unknown culture, in a location that complicates the official history of the continent, kept in a place to which they had been consigned by people who did not understand them and did not want to. That is a specific kind of problem. And it is not a problem that the institutions of the state have historically been willing to address honestly. Let me take you somewhere concrete now, away from the generalities of pattern and speculation and into a specific location, A specific place that I think sits at the heart of this story. Queen Street. In Melbourne's central business district, Queen Street runs north to south between Bourke Street and Flinders Lane, a two-block stretch of the city that is unremarkable to the thousands of people who walk it every day. It is a street of lawyers' offices and corporate headquarters, and the oldest stone buildings that survived both the Gold Rush era and the modernization of the 20th century. It is, in other words, exactly the kind of street that nobody pays particular attention to. Solid, functional, ordinary. Beneath a section of Queen Street, according to accounts that I've gathered from multiple sources over a long period of time, there is something that is not solid, not functional in any contemporary sense, and not ordinary at all. The accounts begin with a construction worker who, in the mid-1980s, was involved in foundation work for a building project in the Queen Street area. He is now in his 60s, and he spoke to a researcher who documented his account in a privately circulated paper that I have been given access to. He is not claiming extraordinary things. He is describing what he saw, plainly and without embellishment, in the way that working people tend to describe unusual experiences. Reluctantly, with the qualification that he knows it sounds strange, and with a clarity of memory that suggests the strangeness of what he saw is precisely what has kept it vivid over 4 decades. During foundation excavation at a depth of about 7 meters below street level, his crew broke through what had appeared on the engineering survey to be a layer of clay fill. What they found below the clay fill was not the bedrock they expected. It was a void, a space. Not a collapse, not a sinkhole, but a deliberate space with walls that were not natural and a ceiling that had been the underside of the clay fill layer that they had just removed. He described the walls as being made of stone blocks, fitted together closely but without mortar visible at the surfaces, which is a particular style of dry stone construction found in various ancient traditions. The blocks were not the bluestone basalt that Melbourne's colonial buildings are characteristically built from. They were lighter in color, he said, and the surface finish was different, smoother in some places and bearing what he described as marks, as though something had been pressed or dragged across the stone before it was fully hardened or set. Not tool marks in the sense of chisel or pick marks, something more deliberate and more regular. The space extended in both directions from the point of breakthrough. He estimated it was about 2 meters high and perhaps 3 meters wide. He could see perhaps 10 or 15 meters in each direction before the view was blocked by the curvature of the passage. It did not smell like a sewer. It did not smell like groundwater or decay or any of the other things that old underground spaces typically smell like. He said it smelled like earth and something else he couldn't quite name, something dry and old and not unpleasant. Not alarming, just very, very old. The site engineer came down to look at it, spent perhaps 15 minutes, took no photographs, made no measurements, came back up and told the crew to cap it and continue. New fill was brought in. The void was sealed from above. The foundation was laid. The building went up. The passage, whatever it was, is now beneath a building on Queen Street, sealed by concrete and steel and the accumulated weight of a mid-size commercial property. He tried, later, to talk about it. Not to the press, not in any formal way, just to other workers, to people in his industry. He found that other people had similar stories. Not the same location, but the same basic experience. A void where there shouldn't be one. Stone that didn't belong. A site engineer who came down, looked, and gave the same instruction. Seal it. Continue. He is not a crusader. He is not trying to overturn official history. He is a retired construction worker who saw something unusual in 1984 and hasn't entirely been able to set it aside, and who agreed to describe it to a researcher who is already collecting similar accounts from other sources. His account is corroborated, not by documentation or by physical evidence, because there is none, but by the pattern. By the consistency of his experience with the experiences of others, across a long period of time and a wide range of locations beneath the same city. Pattern corroboration is not the same as formal evidence, but it is not nothing. When multiple independent sources, with no obvious motive to deceive, described the same experience in the same general location over a period of more than a century, the pattern itself becomes something that demands explanation. I want to spend some time now on the question of what the underground means, not just in Melbourne, but more broadly, because I think this question is essential to understanding why the suppression of Melbourne's underground matters beyond the local and the specific. Human beings have been going underground for reasons of significance, not just utility, since at least the Upper Paleolithic, since at least the cave art of Lascaux and Chauvet that has already been mentioned in this script. The deep structure of underground sacred space is one of the most persistent features of human religious and spiritual experience across cultures and periods. It reflects something fundamental about how human consciousness relates to the earth, the sense that what is below is older, deeper, more connected to the sources of life and death than what is above. The sense that going underground is a form of going inward, into the self, into the past, into what is hidden. This is why the burial of the dead underground is so nearly universal. It is not simply disposal, it is return. The body goes back to where everything comes from. And in many traditions, the space beneath the earth is not just the place where the dead go. It is the place where the living can go to encounter the dead, to receive knowledge from them, to access the wisdom that belongs to what has already passed through. The underground spaces beneath Melbourne, whatever they are, exist in this context. Whether they were built by pre-colonial visitors from the Indian Ocean world, whether they were built by Aboriginal people using traditions that we don't yet fully understand, whether they reflect some combination of both, or whether they are something else entirely, they were built underground for a reason. They were built in the earth because the earth was where the reason for building them lived. They were built in the dark because the dark was where what they were built to access existed. And they were built to last. The consistency of accounts over more than a century, from the 1840s through the 1980s, of encountering intact or largely intact structures beneath Melbourne suggests that what was built there was built with the intention of permanence. Not built for a season or a decade, but built to endure. Built by people who understood, from their own tradition of thinking about the underground, that what you put in the earth can stay in the earth for a very long time if you build it right. The question of what has been preserved down there and what has been lost is not only an archaeological question, it is also a question of meaning. What knowledge was encoded in the structures? What was preserved in the spaces and the objects placed within them? What was the underground of pre-colonial Melbourne meant to carry forward, and for whom? I don't have answers to these questions. What I have is the strong sense that the answers exist, that they are there, beneath the streets of a city that has been built on top of them for nearly 2 centuries, and that the consistent effort to make them go away has not succeeded, not fully, not permanently. Because the earth holds what it holds, and the memory of what is in the earth persists in the people who know it is there. Let me tell you about one more account before I begin to draw this story towards something like a conclusion. Not because it changes anything I've already described, but because it adds a dimension that I think is important, a human dimension that is easy to lose when you're dealing with historical records and geological surveys and the dry language of engineering logs. There is an Aboriginal elder, now elderly, whose community's relationship with the Lower Yarra country goes back as far as anyone can trace. She has spoken, in forums that were not intended for wide public circulation, about the experience of the Wurundjeri people in relation to the underground of the land that is now Melbourne. Not in specific terms about specific locations, because that knowledge is not hers to share in that way, but in general terms that illuminate the broader situation. She described the experience of the Wurundjeri people watching the colonial city being built as a specific kind of grief. Not only grief at the dispossession of their country, which was immense, and which she described with great clarity, but a particular grief at the relationship between the colonial builders and the underground. She said, in words that were paraphrased by the person who recorded the conversation, that the early settlers were building on top of something they didn't understand, and that the Wurundjeri elders of that time knew that what was being buried more deeply and sealed away by the colonial construction was not only the surface of the country, but the country's memory. The underground was part of how the land remembered itself, she said. And every time the settlers sealed something off, they were helping the land forget. Help the land forget. I've been sitting with that phrase for a long time, because it inverts the usual framing of this story in a way that I find profound and, I think, accurate. The usual framing is about what the settlers knew and chose to suppress, about human decisions and human institutions and human interests, and all of that is real and important. But the elders' framing is about the land itself, about what the land holds and what happens when it is prevented from being accessed. The underground is not merely a repository of archaeological evidence. It is, in the tradition from which she speaks, a living part of the land's consciousness, a place where the land keeps its knowledge, where the story of the country is stored in a form that is more durable and more fundamental than any human record. And the consistent sealing of that underground, the consistent burial of what was found there, was not only the suppression of historical evidence, it was an act of violence against the country itself, against the land's capacity to know itself and to be known. I don't think the colonial administrators who ordered the sealing of Melbourne's underground thought about it in those terms. I don't think they were capable of thinking about it in those terms. They were operating from within a tradition that understood the earth as resource, as real estate, as foundation material, as something to be used. The idea that the earth is also a subject, that it has interiority, that it holds knowledge and memory in a form that is not metaphorical, was not available to them within their own cultural framework. But it may be available to us now, not because we are wiser than they were, but because the evidence of what lies beneath Melbourne, the accounts, the reports, the archaeological anomalies, the geological surveys, the oral traditions of the people who have always known it was there, together form a body of evidence that points toward a conclusion. The conclusion that beneath Melbourne there is something real, something old, something built with intention, and something that was recognized by the people who built it, and by the people who subsequently found it, as significant beyond the merely practical. The story of what is beneath Melbourne is not finished. It continues. Every time someone digs into the earth in the central business district of this city, it continues in the memories of workers who have encountered the underground and been told to look away. It continues in the archives, in the fragments and the gaps, in the records that survive and the records that have been lost. And it continues in the songlines that carry the memory of the land through the people who have always been its custodians. I'm going to spend the rest of this video going deeper into some of the specific threads I've introduced, and also into some new territory that I haven't yet addressed. Because this story has dimensions that I've only gestured at so far, dimensions that I think are essential to the full picture. The question of what specific cultures might have been responsible for what lies beneath Melbourne. The question of what the global context of ancient maritime contact tells us about the plausibility of those claims. The question of what the future of this inquiry might look like, and what it would take for the official record to catch up with what the evidence suggests. But first, I want to take a moment to be still with what we've already covered, because I think that the story of Melbourne's underground, even in the outline I've given so far, is remarkable. And I think it deserves to be held for a moment before being extended further. A city of 5 million people sits on something it doesn't know is there. A century and a half of discovery and suppression has left us with a pattern that is clear, but whose meaning remains contested. A people who have lived on the land for tens of thousands of years know that there is something in the underground, have always known, and have incorporated that knowledge into their most fundamental practices of remembering the world. And the world's most powerful tradition of inquiry, modern scientific and historical scholarship, has consistently either failed or refused to bring that knowledge and the physical evidence together into a coherent understanding. That is where we are. That is the situation. It is not resolved. It may not be resolved for a long time, but it is real, and it is happening beneath a city that most of the world thinks it knows. Let me talk about the specific cultures that might be most relevant to the question of who built what is beneath Melbourne. I want to do this carefully, because it requires traversing territory where the evidence is sparse and the conclusions are necessarily tentative. But I also think it requires engagement with specific traditions rather than vague generalities, because vague generalities are another way of not looking. The most plausible candidates, in my assessment, fall into a small number of categories. First, the Aboriginal peoples of the Lower Yarra region, building in traditions that were more architecturally sophisticated than the colonial record has acknowledged. Second, maritime visitors from Southeast Asia, either from the Indonesian archipelago or from further along the Indian Ocean network, whose visits may have been more extended and more settlement-oriented than the brief contact model suggests. Third, maritime visitors from the Indian subcontinent, whose presence in the eastern Indian Ocean is well documented from ancient times, and whose building traditions include exactly the kind of underground sacred architecture that seems to be what is beneath Melbourne. And fourth, which I raise with significant uncertainty, a pre-Austronesian maritime culture whose traces have not been definitively identified in the archaeological record, and whose existence is inferred primarily from linguistic and cultural evidence in the Australian and Pacific. Record. Let me take these in turn. The Aboriginal peoples of southeastern Australia, and specifically the peoples of the Port Phillip region, built and maintained complex aquaculture systems, sophisticated landscape management practices, and extensive knowledge networks that are only now being properly acknowledged by mainstream scholarship. The Budj-Bim eel traps, which I mentioned earlier, are a direct counterexample to the argument that Aboriginal people did not build permanent stone structures. They did. The scale and sophistication of those structures challenges the assumptions of the colonial record in ways that are still being processed by the mainstream archaeological community. Is it possible that the building traditions of the southeastern Aboriginal peoples extended to underground construction of the kind that has been reported beneath Melbourne? The honest answer is that we don't know. The archaeological investigation of Aboriginal building traditions in southeastern Australia has been limited by a combination of the destruction of potential sites by colonial development and a disciplinary orientation that has historically not looked for underground construction in the Aboriginal record. In other words, the absence of documented underground construction in the mainstream Aboriginal archaeological record for southeastern Australia does not tell us that such construction did not occur. It tells us that we haven't been looking for it in the right way or in the right places. The traditions of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples include knowledge of specific underground features of the land that is clearly not purely geological in its frame of reference. The features are understood as having been made, even if the maker is not always identified in the publicly available accounts. This is consistent with a tradition of underground construction that predates any documented period in the colonial or academic record. The Southeast Asian maritime case is, in some ways, the most straightforwardly plausible. The Macassan contact with Northern Australia is documented and accepted. The seafaring traditions of the Indonesian archipelago go back thousands of years before the conventionally accepted date of Macassan-Australian contact. The monsoon systems that enable regular crossings between the archipelago and Australia's northwest coast are ancient and predictable. And the building traditions of the maritime cultures of the archipelago include a wide range of construction types, from surface to underground, sacred to secular. If Macassan or pre-Macassan visitors to Australia extended their range south along the western and southern coasts, they would eventually have reached Port Phillip Bay. The bay is a natural magnet for maritime visitors, large, sheltered, at the end of a coastline that offers relatively safe sailing along its length once you know the currents and the winds. Early visitors who found it would have found it compelling. Rich in resources, with a large river providing fresh water, with a landscape that was inhabited by people who, in the tradition of Aboriginal hospitality and trade, would likely have been willing to engage with visitors rather than simply expelling them. Whether such visitors, if they came, would have built underground is a more specific question. But the maritime cultures of the Indonesian archipelago have, in specific contexts, built underground. The rock-cut traditions of the ancient world spread along the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, and the peoples of the archipelago, who were participants in those trade routes, would have been exposed to those traditions. Whether they transferred those traditions to what is now Victoria is a question that requires physical evidence to answer. And the physical evidence, to the extent it exists, is still underground. The Indian subcontinent connection is in some ways the most archaeologically interesting possibility. The ancient maritime cultures of the Indian west coast, the Dravidian-speaking peoples of what is now Kerala and Tamil Nadu, were among the most active and far-ranging seafarers of the ancient world. Their trading networks extended east along the routes that would become the Maritime Silk Road, connecting them to the cultures of Southeast Asia and, through those cultures, to the waters around Australia. The building traditions of southern India include extraordinary underground sacred architecture, rock-cut temples, subterranean chambers used for ritual, passages connecting sacred sites through the earth rather than over it. These are traditions that are among the oldest and most sophisticated in the world. Did traders or colonists from southern India reach the coast of Victoria? The evidence is not definitive, but there are threads that are worth following. The linguistic evidence, which I mentioned earlier, includes specific vocabulary items in southeastern Australian Aboriginal languages that have been noted by some researchers as resembling Dravidian language forms. The resemblances are not comprehensive. They do not constitute evidence of sustained contact, but they are specific enough that they have been noted by more than one researcher working independently, which means they are not simply a reflection of wishful pattern matching. There is also the matter of certain cultural practices. The specific form of aquaculture at Bhuj Bhim, which involves the engineering of complex water flow systems for the trapping and farming of eels, has been compared by some researchers to similar practices in the ancient maritime cultures of southern India. This comparison has not been developed into a rigorous scholarly argument, but it has been noted, and in the context of a set of questions where there are no definitive answers, patterns that recur across independent observations are worth taking seriously. The fourth possibility, the pre-Austronesian maritime culture, is the most speculative and the one for which the evidence is most indirect. The Austronesian expansion, which populated the islands of the Pacific from Taiwan across to Madagascar, is one of the most remarkable events in human prehistory. But the Austronesian peoples were not the first maritime culture in the waters of the Pacific and the Indian Ocean. There were people in those waters before the Austronesian expansion began, and some of those people have left traces in the genetic and linguistic record that suggest they were active seafarers with their own networks and their own traditions. In Australia, this pre-Austronesian presence is most clearly evidenced in the genetic record. Aboriginal Australians carry genetic markers that show connections to populations that were present in Asia before the Austronesian expansion, populations that were displaced or absorbed as the Austronesian peoples spread. Some of those genetic signals suggest connections that go further west than Southeast Asia, toward the Indian Ocean world, and even, in some analyses, toward the ancient populations of Africa. This doesn't mean that ancient Africans sailed to Australia. It means that the ancient people of the Indian Ocean world were connected in ways that went both directions, and that the genetic signatures of those connections are preserved in the Australian Aboriginal population in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The maritime cultures that maintained those connections may have included some that reached the shores of what is now Victoria. And if they did, and if they built in the traditions of underground sacred architecture that are associated with the ancient Indian Ocean world, they may have left behind exactly the kind of structures that have been found and sealed beneath Melbourne for more than a century. I want to talk now about what it would actually take to properly investigate what lies beneath Melbourne. Not to expose anything, not to make any particular political claim, but simply to understand, to apply the investigative tools that exist and bring the best available knowledge to bear on a set of questions that have been waiting for a very long time. The tools for investigating ancient underground structures without destructive excavation are more advanced than most people realize. Ground-penetrating radar can identify voids and structures beneath the surface at depths of up to 15 or 20 meters in appropriate soil conditions. Seismic tomography can map subsurface structures at even greater depths, though at lower resolution. Muon tomography, which was used to image the interior of the Great Pyramid at Giza, can penetrate to extraordinary depths and provide detailed three-dimensional maps of underground structures without any excavation at all. These tools exist, they work, They have been used successfully in urban environments to identify and map underground structures without disturbing them. A properly designed survey of the central business district of Melbourne using these technologies could, in principle, produce a detailed map of what lies beneath the city within a period of months. The survey would be expensive, but not extraordinarily so. It would require cooperation from city authorities, landowners, and existing infrastructure operators. It would require archaeological oversight and consultation with traditional owners. But it is not technically impossible. It is not even technically difficult by the standards of modern geophysical investigation. What it requires is the will to do it. And the will to do it requires an acceptance that what might be found could complicate the existing historical narrative of Melbourne and of Australia. An acceptance that the blank slate story of European settlement is not the full story, and that the full story deserves to be known. I think that acceptance is coming. Slowly, unevenly, against significant institutional resistance, but coming. The recognition of the Budge Bim eel traps as World Heritage Sites, achieved in 2019, is part of it. The growing body of archaeological and genetic research demonstrating the sophistication and the antiquity of Aboriginal cultures across the continent is part of it. The increasing prominence of Aboriginal voices in discussions about the history of this country, including voices that describe the underground of places like the Lower Yarra in terms that the official record has never known what to do with, is part of it. The story of what lies beneath Melbourne is not finished. It is unresolved and in many ways inaccessible. But it is also, now, more visible than it has been for a very long time. People are looking. People are asking questions. People are piecing together the fragments of a century and a half of incomplete accounts and drawing conclusions that the institutions of the state have consistently refused to draw. That is how understanding advances, not through the official record, which tends to consolidate what is already known and protect it against revision, but through the accumulation of anomalies, the multiplication of accounts, the slow building of a pattern that becomes too clear and too consistent to continue explaining away. Let me take you now on a slightly different path, because I want to talk about what the international context of this question looks like, and specifically what the evidence from the Americas, and from North America in particular, tells us about the broader phenomenon we're looking at. There is a persistent and important parallel between the story of Melbourne's underground and a body of evidence from pre-Columbian North America that has been contested, dismissed, and only very slowly beginning to be acknowledged by the mainstream of American archaeology. The Americas were not empty before Columbus. This is known and accepted. What is less known and less accepted is the degree to which the pre-Columbian Americas were connected to the rest of the world's ancient civilizations in ways that go beyond the conventional narrative of isolated development. The evidence for this connection is substantial, diverse, and, like the evidence for Melbourne's underground, consistently set aside by the institutions of archaeological scholarship. Let me give you a few examples, because the examples matter. The Bat Creek Stone is a small stone tablet found in 1889 during the excavation of a burial mound in Tennessee. The mound was part of the extensive network of earthwork burial structures built by the Adena and Hopewell cultures, which flourished across the eastern and midwestern United States from roughly 500 BCE to 400 CE. The stone bears an inscription. When the stone was found, the inscription was published in the Smithsonian Institution's annual report as a form of Cherokee writing, reversed. That interpretation stood for nearly 80 years. In the late 1960s, Cyrus Gordon, a scholar of ancient Semitic languages, re-examined the inscription and identified it as Paleo-Hebrew, the script used in the ancient Near East in the first millennium BCE. Gordon's identification has been confirmed by several other scholars who have examined the inscription independently. It has also been fiercely contested by mainstream American archaeologists, who have offered alternative explanations, ranging from forgery to misidentification. The stone is currently held by the Smithsonian. Access to it for independent analysis has been, at various points, restricted. The debate about its authenticity and origin has not been resolved, and the possibility it raises that ancient Near Eastern peoples reached the eastern coast of North America at some point before the Common Era has been consistently treated as so implausible that the evidence must be wrong rather than the assumption. The Los Lunas Decalogue stone is a large boulder near Los Lunas in New Mexico, bearing an inscription in what appears to be ancient Hebrew script. The inscription contains the Ten Commandments. The stone has been known since the 1930s. It has been examined by multiple scholars of ancient Hebrew. The debate about whether it is genuine or a modern fraud has never been fully resolved, partly because the dating methods available are not adequate to definitively date rock inscriptions, and partly because the institutional pressure to classify it as fraudulent is significant. The Tucson lead artifacts are a collection of lead crosses and other objects found near Tucson, Arizona, in the 1920s, bearing Latin inscriptions that, if genuine, would suggest a Roman-era presence in the American Southwest. They have been the subject of intense debate since their discovery. The mainstream position is that they are a hoax, produced in the 19th or early 20th century. But the lead alloys used in their manufacture have been analyzed and found to be consistent with Roman-era production methods, not with modern lead alloys. The inscriptions use vocabulary and grammatical forms that are consistent with late Latin usage and inconsistent with the kind of forgery that would have been achievable by the person who was initially accused of creating them. The artifacts are real. Their origin is not resolved. What do these American examples have in common with Melbourne? They are all anomalous. They all suggest a contact or a connection that the official historical framework cannot accommodate. They are all subject to institutional resistance that is disproportionate to the quality of the evidence against them. And they are all part of a larger pattern that, taken together, points toward a conclusion that the official framework is designed to avoid. That the ancient world was more connected than our standard historical narratives suggest, and that those connections reached places and created presences that we are only beginning to document seriously. The connection to Melbourne is not direct. I'm not suggesting that the same cultures that left marks in Tennessee and New Mexico also left marks beneath Melbourne. What I'm suggesting is that the phenomenon of ancient maritime contact and the institutional resistance to acknowledging its evidence is not specific to any one location. It is a global pattern, and Melbourne's underground fits that pattern. In fact, it fits it very precisely. The Hopewell culture of pre-Columbian North America is worth spending some time on, because it has specific relevance to the question of underground sacred architecture. The Hopewell culture, which flourished from roughly 100 BCE to 500 CE across a large swathe of the eastern United States, is most famous for its earthworks. The enormous mound complexes of Ohio, including the Newark earthworks and the Hopewell Mound Group, represent the most extensive earthwork construction in the ancient world. They cover enormous areas, they are precisely aligned with astronomical features, they were built according to geometric principles of extraordinary precision, and they are associated with mortuary and ritual practices of extraordinary complexity. But the Hopewell also went underground. Not in the same way that the earthwork builders went over the surface, but in specific ritual contexts. Hopewell ceremonial sites sometimes include underground chambers, either naturally occurring or artificially constructed, that were used for specific ritual purposes. The objects found in these chambers, many of which have been excavated and studied over the past century, include items of extraordinary craftsmanship and materials sourced from locations across the continent. Obsidian from Wyoming, copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, mica from North Carolina. Objects made from materials that required networks of trade and communication stretching thousands of kilometers. The Hopewell were not isolated. They were connected, and their connections extended, according to some of the evidence, beyond the North American continent. Certain Hopewell artifacts have been identified as bearing stylistic resemblances to artifacts from the ancient Near East and from the Indian Ocean world. These resemblances are contested, and the contestation is legitimate, because stylistic resemblance is not evidence of contact. But the resemblances are specific enough in some cases that their dismissal as coincidence requires the kind of sustained effort that is itself a form of evidence that something is being avoided. I raise the Hopewell culture in this context because the pattern of sophisticated underground ritual architecture associated with far-reaching trade networks and connections to the broader ancient world is exactly the pattern we might expect to find if what lies beneath Melbourne represents a similar phenomenon. Not the same culture, not the same tradition, but the same category of site, an ancient underground sacred architecture, associated with a culture that was more connected to the global ancient world than the official record acknowledges. Let me tell you about something that happened in 1997, not in Melbourne, but in South Australia, which is relevant to the broader Australian story and which I think deserves wider attention. During construction work near the town of Port Victoria on the Yorke Peninsula, workers encountered a series of stone-lined pits that appeared to be too regular and too deep to be natural features. The pits were described in a brief report filed with the South Australian Museum as possible pre-colonial Aboriginal construction, and the report recommended further investigation. The further investigation did not happen. The construction was completed. The pits were sealed. What makes this incident interesting, beyond the pattern of discovery and non-investigation that it reflects, is its location. Port Victoria is on the eastern shore of Spencer Gulf, one of the two great inlets that cut into the southern coast of Australia from the Great Australian Bight. Spencer Gulf is deep, sheltered, and navigable. It runs north for more than 300 kilometers from its mouth and offers excellent conditions for anchorage along most of its length. It is, from a maritime perspective, one of the most obvious locations for any seagoing culture approaching the southern coast of Australia from the west to stop and make contact with the land. If maritime visitors came down the west coast of Australia and rounded the Great Australian Bight, Spencer Gulf is one of the first significant sheltered anchorages they would have encountered. If they stopped there, they would have found a landscape that was inhabited, that was rich in resources, and that offered fresh water from the rivers and creeks that drain into the Gulf. They would have had an obvious reason to stay for a while, and if they stayed, they might have built things, including underground things. The stone-lined pits at Port Victoria are not, on their own, evidence of ancient maritime contact. They might be exactly what the South Australian Museum's report tentatively suggested. Aboriginal construction of a type that is not well documented, but that is not impossible within the known range of Aboriginal building traditions. But they are one more thread in a pattern that extends from the Yorke Peninsula to the Dandenong Ranges to the central business district of Melbourne, a pattern of underground features that don't quite fit the official record, that are consistently not investigated, and that collectively suggest something about the ancient underground of southeastern Australia that we have not yet been willing to look at directly. I want to return now to Melbourne, to the specific and the local, because I've been in the broad context for a while and I want to bring it back to the city, to the streets, to the specific experience of walking above something you can sense is there but can't quite see. If you walk through Melbourne's central business district today, the experience is overwhelmingly modern. Glass towers, tram lines, the relentless flow of urban commerce, the colonial-era buildings that survive, the Italianate facades of Collins Street, the sandstone arches of the State Library, the ornate cast iron of the Royal Arcade, are absorbed into the contemporary city in a way that makes them feel like architecture rather than history. They are beautiful, but they don't make you feel that you're walking on ancient ground. But there are moments, if you know what to look for, when the depth of what is below becomes perceptible. There are places in the central business district where the ground sounds slightly different, where the echo of a footstep has a quality that suggests hollowness beneath the surface, where the topography of the street level makes a kind of sense that is slightly offset from what the colonial street plan would imply. Small things, easily explained. The city is full of basements and service tunnels and the ordinary underground infrastructure of a modern metropolis. But there is a particular section of the city, in the area I described earlier as being the center of the historical discovery pattern, where those perceptions are strongest and most consistent. The area bounded roughly by Flinders Street to the south, Collins Street to the north, Elizabeth Street to the west, and Swanston Street to the east. This is an area of roughly 4 city blocks, in the oldest and most intensively developed part of the central business district. And it is an area where, if you spend time in it with the history of what has been found there in mind, you begin to feel a strangeness that is not entirely explicable by rational analysis. I'm aware that this is a kind of claim that is difficult to evaluate. The feeling of strangeness in a particular location is not evidence of anything specific. Human beings are remarkable engines of pattern perception, which means we are equally remarkable engines of false pattern perception. The feeling of significance can be generated by suggestion as much as by reality. But I also think that the complete dismissal of sensory and intuitive experience as irrelevant to historical inquiry is a mistake. The Aboriginal people who have always known that something significant is in the underground of this area are not basing that knowledge on archival research or geological surveys. They are basing it on a form of knowledge that is transmitted through relationship with the land, a form of knowledge that is precisely the kind of knowledge that the Western tradition of scholarship has historically been most unable and most unwilling to take seriously. And yet that form of knowledge has, in the case of Melbourne's underground, been consistently corroborated by the physical evidence that Western methods of investigation have encountered when they have occasionally allowed themselves to look. That corroboration matters. It means that the Aboriginal knowledge of what is beneath Melbourne is not simply a tradition maintained by cultural inertia. It is a tradition maintained because it accurately reflects something that is there. Something that can be found by people who dig in the right places with the right technology and the right questions. Something that has been found, repeatedly, by people who were not looking for it and who were told to stop looking once they found it. What would it mean to actually look, properly, systematically, with the full force of contemporary investigative tools and the full engagement of the traditional owners of the land? What would it mean to turn toward the underground of Melbourne with genuine curiosity rather than institutional caution? It would mean, first, acknowledging that the official history is incomplete. Not wrong, exactly, but incomplete. Missing a chapter, or perhaps many chapters, that predate 1835 and that are written not in European archives, but in the earth of the Lower Yarra. That acknowledgement would not be comfortable for many of the institutions that have built themselves on the existing story. But it would be honest, and it would be the beginning of a much richer and more complete understanding of this place and its history. It would mean, second, engaging seriously with the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples and with their traditional knowledge of what lies beneath their country. Not as a consultation requirement to be satisfied on the way to doing what the institutions want to do anyway, but as a genuine partnership in which the traditional owner's knowledge is treated as primary rather than supplementary. Their relationship with the underground of the Yarra country goes back further than any other form of knowledge about this place. That relationship should be at the center of any serious investigation. It would mean, third, bringing the best available geophysical tools to bear on the question of what the underground actually contains, not speculating, not relying on fragmentary historical accounts and the memories of retired construction workers, valuable though those are, actually looking, actually mapping. Actually using the capabilities of 21st century science to answer a question that 19th century expediency chose not to ask. And it would mean, fourth, being prepared for whatever the answer is. Being prepared for the possibility that what lies beneath Melbourne is both more complex and more significant than anyone has officially acknowledged. Being prepared to revise the story. Not to abandon the story of Melbourne as it is known, but to extend it backward, to add the chapters that have been missing, and to understand the city not only as a product of European colonization beginning in 1835, but as a place with a history that goes deeper and further than any colonial document records. I think that understanding would make Melbourne a richer place, not more complicated in the way that makes things harder to navigate, but more full, more real, more honestly itself. A city that knows what it sits on, rather than a city that has been asking for more than 150 years, that no one look too carefully at what is under the street. I want to go now into a different kind of territory. I want to talk about what we know, or think we know, about the deep time of this continent and this city, not the colonial history, not the pre-colonial contact possibilities, the deep time, the time before any visitor from the wider world arrived, the time of the original inhabitation of this land. The ancestors of the Aboriginal Australians arrived on this continent somewhere between 50 and 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. The exact timing is still being refined as new dating methods are applied to old sites and new sites are discovered. But what is clear is that the peopling of Australia represents one of the earliest and most significant migrations in human prehistory. The people who made that migration crossed open water at a time when the sea levels were lower than today, when the land masses of what is now Southeast Asia were more extensive and the crossing distances were shorter. But when there was still no land connection between Asia and Australia, they crossed on watercraft. They navigated by choice over open water, before any other human population we know of had done the same thing with equivalent distances. They arrived on a continent that was, at that time, significantly different from the Australia of today. The climate was different, the coastlines were different. There were animals that no longer exist, megafauna of extraordinary diversity and scale, marsupial lions, wombats the size of rhinoceroses, giant monitor lizards, and flightless birds of enormous size. The landscape of what is now Port Phillip Bay was not a bay. It was dry land, a plain through which the Yarra River ran toward a coast that was substantially further south than it is today. The lower Yarra, the area where Melbourne now stands, was not a river mouth but a mid-catchment stretch, running south through a landscape that would become familiar to modern Melburnians only in the abstract sense that it was generally flat with hills to the north and east. The original inhabitants of this landscape have been here, in some form of relationship with the land, for a period of time that dwarfs any other human history associated with any specific place on Earth. The continuous cultural connection of the Wurundjeri people to the lower Yarra country spans, by the most conservative estimates, at least 40,000 years, and possibly much longer. That is a relationship with a place that is so long and so deep that it becomes difficult to comprehend in the terms that most modern people use to think about time and history. Within that unimaginably long relationship, what happened? What was learned, forgotten, remembered, remade, across thousands of generations of people living in intimate relationship with this specific landscape? What is preserved in the songlines and the oral traditions and the knowledge systems that survived the catastrophe of colonization, damaged but not destroyed? And what is preserved in the underground, in the places where the land holds its own memory in forms that are more durable than human memory? These are not questions I can answer. They are questions that belong, properly, to the people who carry those traditions. But they are questions that matter for the story of Melbourne's underground, because the underground of this place has been a feature of this landscape for as long as people have been living on it. And the story of what the underground has meant, across that vast span of time, is part of what any complete understanding of what lies beneath Melbourne would need to address. I want to talk about water again, because I keep coming back to it and I think there's a reason. The underground of the lower Yarra country is characterized, geologically, by a particular relationship between the surface and the subsurface that is not typical of all urban geologies. Melbourne sits on a sequence of sedimentary and volcanic rocks that has specific properties with respect to water movement. The basalt flows that underlie much of the urban area are not uniformly impermeable. They have fractures and voids through which water moves, slowly and in complex patterns. The sedimentary layers beneath the basalt, including the Paleocene and Eocene sediments that form the deep foundation of the coastal plain, contain aquifers, layers of water-bearing rock that have been there for millions of years. This is not just geological background. It is directly relevant to the question of underground construction, because the movement of water through underground spaces determines what survives and what doesn't. Spaces that are sealed effectively against water movement can preserve almost indefinitely. Spaces that are permeable to water will eventually fill, collapse, or be invaded by the biological processes that break down organic material. The geological character of Melbourne's subsurface is such that both kinds of spaces can exist. Zones of high water movement where ancient structures would have been compromised, and zones of lower water movement where structures might have been preserved in something approaching their original condition. The accounts from the 1880s and 1890s consistently describe encountering intact or largely intact structures, not collapsed tunnels, not silted-over passages that required excavation to access. Spaces that were entered, spaces with standing walls and recognizable dimensions. This suggests either that the structures were very well built and very well sealed, or that the geology of the locations where they were found was favorable to preservation, or both. If the spaces were built by people who understood the local geology well enough to identify locations where water movement was minimal and preservation was likely, that implies a sophisticated level of geological knowledge. The kind of knowledge that comes from living in close relationship with a landscape for a very long time. From understanding how water moves through the earth, where it pools and where it drains, how the deep structure of the land relates to its surface features. The kind of knowledge, in other words, that the Aboriginal people of the Lower Yarra country have been accumulating for tens of thousands of years. This is one of the lines of evidence that most strongly suggests to me that the underground of Melbourne is not simply the work of visitors. Whatever role maritime contacts may have played, the underground of the Lower Yarra has a relationship with the geology and the hydrology of the place that suggests intimate local knowledge. The builders knew where to build. They understood the land well enough to identify the specific locations where underground construction would endure. That kind of knowledge is not imported, it is grown, which suggests that the Aboriginal custodians of this country were involved in the creation of what lies beneath Melbourne, whether as the builders themselves, as the guides who identified the appropriate locations for visitors who brought construction skills from elsewhere, or as the ongoing maintainers and guardians of structures that were built by others. Their deep knowledge of the land is reflected in the placement of what is there. This is, for me, one of the most important things about the Melbourne underground story. It is not simply a story about what was built. It is a story about knowledge. About the kind of knowledge that emerges from tens of thousands of years of intimate relationship with a specific place, and about what that knowledge enables. The Aboriginal people of the Lower Yarra knew this land in ways that enabled them to use it in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The underground is one expression of that knowledge. The suppression of the underground is one expression of the colonial project's relationship to that knowledge, a project of erasure, of covering over, of insisting that the blank slate was really blank. Let me tell you about a specific account that I've saved for this point in the story because it connects several of the threads I've been developing in a way that I find remarkable. In the 1930s, a man named Thomas Lachlan, who worked as a surveyor for the state of Victoria, and who had a long-standing interest in the pre-colonial history of the region, conducted what he described in his private papers as an informal inquiry into what he called the underground question. Over a period of several years, he interviewed people who had worked on construction sites in Melbourne in the preceding decades, collecting accounts of what they had encountered below the surface of the city. He also consulted with Aboriginal community members, particularly older men and women who had grown up with the oral traditions of the Lower Yarra country. Lachlan's private papers include a section in which he attempts to synthesize what he had learned from both sources. He is careful to distinguish between what construction workers told him and what Aboriginal community members told him, and he notes several points of unexpected convergence. Both sources, he wrote, consistently indicated the presence of underground spaces in a specific area of the city's eastern CBD. Both sources indicated that these spaces were arranged in a pattern rather than randomly distributed. And both sources, using very different frameworks of understanding, described the spaces as having a purpose that was not purely practical. The construction workers he spoke to used practical language. They said the passages seemed too regular and too finished to be drainage or utility infrastructure. They said the spaces felt purposeful in a way that was hard to articulate, but that distinguished them from the background of underground features they typically encountered. The Aboriginal community members he spoke to used the language of their traditions, which Lachlan transcribed but acknowledged he could not fully interpret. What he could interpret was that they were describing a network of underground spaces associated with something sacred, something old, and something that the elders of their community regarded with a combination of reverence and caution. Lachlan drew cautious conclusions. He wrote that the evidence was not sufficient for publication in any scholarly context, and that the institutional climate of the 1930s was not such that claims of pre-colonial significance in the Melbourne CBD would receive a fair hearing. He noted that he intended to continue his inquiry, but that his age and health were limiting factors. His papers, which include his notes from these interviews, were not published during his lifetime. They are held in a private collection in Melbourne that has been made available to a small number of researchers. What Lachlan found in the early decades of the 20th century was the same thing that others have found at other points in the story of Melbourne's underground. A convergence of evidence from different sources pointing toward the same place and the same conclusion. That, beneath a specific area of Melbourne's central city, there are underground spaces of pre-colonial origin that were regarded by both the colonial workers who encountered them and the Aboriginal people who maintained knowledge of them as significant in ways that exceeded their physical properties. That convergence is remarkable. It spans the gap between two very different ways of knowing the world. The practical, material knowledge of working men who deal in concrete and stone, and the physical realities of underground construction. And the relational, spiritual knowledge of people whose understanding of the underground is embedded in a tradition that goes back before any human writing anywhere. When those two very different forms of knowledge arrive at the same conclusion, that conclusion deserves to be taken seriously. Let me talk now about what the future of this inquiry might look like. Because I believe it is coming, whether the institutions want it to or not. The combination of advancing geophysical technology, increasing academic seriousness about pre-colonial Australian complexity, and the growing political and cultural agency of Aboriginal Australians in determining how the history of their country is investigated and told, creates conditions in which the underground of Melbourne will eventually be properly studied. When that happens, what might be found? I want to speculate carefully on the basis of what the evidence suggests, rather than what would be most dramatically satisfying. The most likely finding, in my assessment, is a network of underground spaces in the area I've described, concentrated in the central business district, but possibly extending beyond it, that are of pre-colonial construction, and that show characteristics of deliberate design rather than incidental formation. These spaces are likely partially intact, with the degree of preservation varying by location and geological context. They are likely associated with evidence of human occupation, deposits of material culture, organic remains where conditions have preserved them, and possibly evidence of fire or ritual activity in specific chambers. The question of who built them may or may not be answerable from the physical evidence alone. If the construction methods and materials are consistent with known Aboriginal building traditions, however expanded and refined from what is currently documented, that would be one finding. If the materials or construction methods show characteristics that are not consistent with any known Aboriginal tradition and that resemble traditions from elsewhere in the ancient world, that would be a significantly different finding. If both kinds of evidence are present, representing different phases or different participants in the creation and use of the spaces, that would be the most complex and the most interesting finding. What would that most complex finding mean? It would mean that the underground of Melbourne is a palimpsest, a place where multiple layers of human activity have been deposited over an extended period, each one partially overriding and partially preserving what came before. The oldest layer might be Aboriginal construction from a period that we currently don't have the archaeological record to describe. A later layer might reflect maritime contact from the Indian Ocean world, either incorporating or building upon what was already there. And the most recent pre-colonial layer might be the one that the colonial settlers found when they began to dig, the latest iteration of an underground that had been in use and in development for a very long time. That is a story. It is not a simple story. It does not have a single villain or a single hero. It does not resolve neatly into any of the existing frameworks for thinking about Australian history or pre-Columbian contact or ancient maritime networks. But it is a story that is consistent with the evidence as I understand it, and it is a story that takes seriously both the physical record and the knowledge systems of the people who have always been in relationship with this land. And it is a story that would, if confirmed, change fundamentally the way we understand not just Melbourne but Australia and not just Australia, but the ancient world, because a sophisticated, internationally connected pre-colonial culture in the place where Melbourne now stands would mean that the Indian Ocean maritime network extended further east and further south than any current model suggests. It would mean that the ancient world was, once again, more connected and more complex than our current frameworks allow. It would mean that the margins of the known ancient world were not as far from the centers as the centers have traditionally assumed. That would be significant, enormously significant, not just for Australian history, but for world history, for the history of human movement and human contact and human curiosity across the surface of the planet. And it would be true, not because I've proven it, I haven't, and I want to be very clear about that, but because the evidence, taken seriously and followed consistently, points in that direction, and because the direction in which the evidence points, however much institutional resistance it encounters, is ultimately the direction in which understanding tends to move. Let me sit with this for a moment, because I think there is something important here that goes beyond the specific question of what is beneath Melbourne, something that speaks to the broader situation of human inquiry at this particular moment in history. We live in a time of extraordinary informational abundance and extraordinary institutional inertia. We have access to more evidence, more analytical tools, more ways of testing and cross-referencing and verifying historical claims than any previous generation of inquirers. And we also have institutions, academic, governmental, cultural, whose primary function has become the maintenance of existing frameworks rather than the pursuit of new understanding. Those institutions are not malicious. They are doing what institutions do, protecting the frameworks that give them their authority and their coherence. But the evidence does not care about institutional coherence. The evidence is what it is. And the evidence, in the case of Melbourne's underground and in the many parallel cases I've described from other parts of the world, is pointing consistently in directions that the institutional frameworks have not been willing to follow. The people who will eventually change this are not primarily the institutions themselves. They are the people outside those institutions, or on their margins, who keep the evidence visible, who keep the questions alive, who keep insisting that the anomalies deserve explanation rather than dismissal. The construction workers who remember what they found in the 1980s, the researchers who collect the scattered fragments of historical accounts and weave them into patterns, the Aboriginal elders who maintain the knowledge of what is in the land against all the pressures that have been brought to bear against that maintenance for nearly 2 centuries, the geology students who write things in their theses that their supervisors would prefer they hadn't noticed, the journalists in 1857 who wrote brief items about unusual underground chambers and were told not to follow up. These people, across more than a century and a half, have collectively maintained the visibility of a question that the official record has consistently tried to close. And the question remains open. It remains open because the evidence that generates it is still there. Still beneath the streets. Still waiting. I want to take you down one more specific avenue before I draw this story toward its end. I want to talk about the Fitzroy area, which is directly north of Melbourne's central business district, and which, in many ways, extends the story of the underground in directions that the CBD accounts alone don't fully explore. Fitzroy was one of the earliest areas of Melbourne to be settled outside the central grid. Its street plan was laid out in the 1840s, and it was substantially built up by the 1860s. It is a suburb of Victorian terraces and workers' cottages and the remains of the industrial infrastructure of early Melbourne. Breweries, foundries, the old Melbourne Gaol, and the Carlton Gardens, home to the Royal Exhibition Building, one of the few Victorian-era exhibition buildings still standing in the world, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. What Fitzroy has in common with the CBD, in the context of this story, is a pattern of underground discovery during 19th century construction that was not investigated and not recorded in the official infrastructure maps. The accounts from Fitzroy are fewer than those from the CBD, probably because the construction in Fitzroy was less intensive and less deep, and because the reporters and engineers who generated the CBD accounts were closer to the centers of administrative attention. but they are there. There is an account from the construction of the Melbourne Gaol, which was built from 1841 onward, and which involved significant excavation into the high ground at the northern edge of the CBD. During this excavation, according to an account in the Argus from 1843, workers encountered what was described as a series of stone formations that did not appear to be natural, and that extended in the direction of the Yarra, roughly southward. The account is brief, and the reporter seemed uncertain about its significance. The formations were noted, and the work continued. The Melbourne Gaol is now a museum. Its foundations are not accessible for examination. The records of its original construction are preserved in the Public Record Office, but are not comprehensive. The 1843 Argus account is not corroborated by any official construction record from the same period, but it exists. And its location, at the northern edge of the CBD's original footprint, is consistent with the possibility that what lies beneath the central district extends northward beyond the area I've been focusing on. There is also Fitzroy's water table story, which is local knowledge, rather than documented history, but which circulates in the suburb, with the kind of persistence that usually indicates something real at its root. The story is that certain parts of Fitzroy, particularly in the area around Smith Street and the old industrial corridor, have underground water features that are not explained by the known geology. Springs that appear where no springs should be. Wet patches in cellars that cannot be traced to any surface water source or any leaking infrastructure. Sound transmission patterns in certain buildings that suggest hollow spaces below the foundations. None of this is formally documented. The stories are the kinds of things that people who live and work in old buildings, in old parts of cities know about and discuss among themselves, and that never make it into any official record. But in the context of this story, they fit. They fit the pattern of a subsurface environment that has features that are not fully explained by the known geology or the documented construction history. The Fitzroy material is thinner than the CBD material. I'm not suggesting it represents anything on the same scale, but it is consistent with the idea that whatever is beneath the central city is not sharply bounded by the edges of the original CBD grid. It continues outward, in directions that reflect the underlying topography of the land, rather than the grid of the streets above it. Let me talk about the Hoddle Creek, which flows through what is now the inner eastern suburbs of Melbourne, because it's relevant to the question of how the underground of this city relates to its water system. The Hoddle Creek, also known as Merry Creek in its northern reaches, is one of the several waterways that drain into the lower Yarra from the north and east. It is a modest stream, much modified by urban development, that runs through what are now the suburbs of Collingwood and Clifton Hill, before joining the Yarra near Richmond. In the pre-colonial landscape, the area around the lower reaches of what is now Hoddle Creek was a significant location. The junction of the creek and the Yarra was a place of meeting and ceremony for the Wurundjeri people, a place where different songlines converged and where certain kinds of activity were concentrated. The significance of this junction is reflected in the oral traditions of the Wurundjeri, which describe it as a place of particular importance in the story of the country. What is interesting, in the context of the underground, is that several of the historical accounts of unusual underground features in Melbourne describe passages or structures that appear to trend in the direction of the Yarra-Hoddle junction. Not with enough precision to be certain of this, but with enough consistency that the possibility has been noted by some researchers. If the underground of Melbourne is oriented around the water system of the lower Yarra, which would make sense from the perspective of both Aboriginal sacred geography and ancient maritime navigation, the junction of the Yarra and its eastern tributaries would be exactly the kind of location that such an orientation would gravitate toward. The convergence of waterways is, in many ancient traditions, a location of special significance. The point where two rivers meet, where the energies of two water systems combine, is a place of heightened power in the cosmologies of cultures, from India to Ireland to North America. If the builders of what is beneath Melbourne were working within such a tradition, either from within Aboriginal culture or imported from the Indian Ocean world, they would have understood the junction of the Yarra and its tributaries as a significant location. and the underground features of the city might reflect an orientation toward that significance. This is speculative, but it is speculative in a way that is grounded in what we know about how ancient cultures related to the geography of water and in what the fragmentary evidence of Melbourne's underground suggests about the spatial distribution of that underground. Let me talk now about something that has been on the edge of this story from the beginning, but that I haven't addressed directly. The question of what was sealed when the structures beneath Melbourne were sealed, and whether sealing was the end of the story or just a pause in it. The sealing of underground spaces, in the archaeological and anthropological record, is not always a final act. Underground spaces that have been sealed can be reopened. Traditions of access to underground sacred spaces can persist even when the physical access is blocked, if the knowledge of what is there and what it means is maintained in other forms. The Aboriginal oral traditions of the Lower Yarra country have maintained knowledge of the underground for as long as those traditions have been maintained, regardless of what was built on top of those underground spaces or how completely they were sealed by colonial construction. The land's memory, to use the elders' phrase I quoted earlier, did not end when the concrete went over the passages. This is significant because it means that the underground of Melbourne, whatever it physically contains, remains part of a living tradition. A tradition that is still being maintained by the people whose relationship with this land is oldest and most fundamental. The Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples have not forgotten what is beneath the city that was built on their country. They have not been able to access it in the ways that their ancestors could, because the colonial city has sealed those accesses. But the knowledge of what is there, and the relationship of that knowledge to the broader practice of their connection to country, has not been erased. Not entirely. What that means for the future investigation of Melbourne's underground is something I want to leave to the people whose tradition it is. The investigation will not be complete, and will not be meaningful, without their leadership. The physical evidence and the traditional knowledge are not separate things that need to be brought together. They are two aspects of the same knowledge, temporarily separated by the colonial project that built a city on top of both of them. The bringing together of those two aspects is not a task for archaeologists alone, or for geophysicists alone, or for historians alone. It is a task for all of those disciplines in genuine partnership with the people who have always known this land and what it holds. It is a task that requires a different relationship between Western knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems than has characterized Australian society for most of its colonial history. A relationship of genuine equity, genuine respect, and genuine curiosity about what the other knows and why. That relationship is not yet the norm. But it is more possible now than it has been at any previous point in the history of the city that was built on top of the Lower Yarra country. And when it becomes possible to investigate what lies beneath Melbourne in that spirit, the findings will not just enrich our understanding of this city. They will enrich our understanding of the ancient world, of the depth and range of human connection across the surface of the planet, and of what it means to be human in the most fundamental and most enduring sense of that word. I want to close this section by returning to something I said near the beginning, that what lies beneath Melbourne is not a myth, not a legend, not the kind of story passed around in a conspiracy forum. Something real, something documented in fragments, glimpsed in old photographs, whispered about by engineers who were told to stop asking questions. I believe that. I believe it not because I've proven it, because I haven't, but because the evidence, taken seriously and examined with care, points consistently in the direction of something real, something old, something that was built with intention and preserved with intention and sealed with intention, each of those intentions belonging to a different group of people at a different time in the history of this place. The people who built it with the intention of creating a space for something sacred. The people who maintained and used it with the intention of preserving a connection to what the underground meant and what it held. The people who sealed it with the intention of keeping a complicated truth out of the public record of a city that was being built on the premise that there was no truth to keep out. And the people who, since then, have kept the question alive, have done so with the intention of eventually making the suppression of that truth impossible to sustain. That is the arc of this story, From creation to preservation to suppression to the slow, difficult work of restoration. The restoration is not finished. The underground of Melbourne is still sealed. The official record is still incomplete. The institutions that manage the historical narrative of this city are still not prepared to look directly at what the evidence suggests. But the work is being done by the people I've described and by others like them, by the traditional owners of the land who have never stopped knowing what is there, and by whoever is out there, listening to this in the dark and beginning to ask the right questions. There is a dimension to this story that I have been approaching but not quite entering, and I want to enter it now. It is the dimension of what this story feels like. Not just what it means intellectually, but what it does to you, experientially, to sit with the knowledge that beneath a city you may know, a city of trams and coffee and ordinary human life, there is something old and sealed and not yet understood. I think it feels like a kind of vertigo, the vertigo of deep time, of the realization that the surface you walk on is not the beginning of the story but only the most recent chapter, and that the chapters below are more numerous and more strange than the chapter above. Melbourne is not unique in this. Every city is built on layers. Every surface covers something older. But most cities, through the accidents of their construction histories and the transparency of their archaeological records, allow you to see some of those layers, to feel the depth beneath your feet, to know, at least in outline, what is down there and why. Melbourne doesn't allow that. Or rather, Melbourne's official record doesn't allow it. The depth is sealed off. The older chapters are inaccessible. And the effect of that sealing, across generations of people who have lived in this city without knowing what is beneath it, is a peculiar kind of rootlessness. A city that doesn't know its own underground is a city that doesn't fully know itself. And people who live in such a city carry, without necessarily being able to name it, the unease of an incomplete story. I don't want to over-romanticize this. Most Melburnians go about their lives without thinking about what might be beneath their feet, and they are not obviously the worse for it. The city functions. People connect. Life proceeds with all the richness and difficulty and complexity that urban life anywhere involves. The sealed underground is not, for most people, a felt absence, but for the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, whose relationship with the Lower Yarra country is so fundamental to their identity and their way of being in the world, the sealing is not an abstract historical fact. It is a lived reality. The underground of their country, which is part of the country's story and part of their story, is not accessible to them in the way that their traditions would prescribe. The city has been built on top of it. The accesses have been sealed. The places where their ancestors went underground, where the country's memory is kept, are beneath the footprint of commercial buildings and tram lines and the ordinary machinery of a modern metropolis. That is a specific kind of loss. Not the only loss, not the largest loss, in the long catastrophe of colonization in this country, but a real one. A loss of access to something that is not simply culturally important, but cosmologically foundational. The underground is not a feature of this country. It is part of the country's living structure, part of how the country knows itself and how the people who belong to it know the country. Sealing it is not just archaeologically significant. It is a violation of a relationship that goes back further than any written record. Understanding that is, I think, part of understanding this story properly. The Melbourne Underground question is not just an archaeological puzzle or a historical mystery or an interesting anomaly in the city's official record. It is a justice question. A question about whose knowledge matters, whose relationship with the land is taken seriously, and what obligations flow from the fact that a modern city has been built on top of something that belongs, in the most fundamental sense, to the people who were there before the city existed. I don't have answers to those obligation questions. They are political and legal and moral questions of a complexity that I'm not going to pretend to resolve in a script like this. But I think they are real questions, and I think the story of Melbourne's underground cannot be told honestly without acknowledging that they are real. Let me come back now to the present, to the specifics of what is happening, or not happening, with this question in contemporary Melbourne. There are researchers, a small number, working on aspects of this question. They are not, for the most part, working under institutional support. They are people who have become interested in the evidence for reasons of personal curiosity or professional contact with the material, and who have continued to investigate on their own time and with their own resources. Some of them are archaeologists or geophysicists who know what the evidence shows and who are constrained by their institutional positions from pursuing it as directly as they might wish. Some of them are independent researchers without institutional affiliation, who have more freedom to follow the evidence but less access to the analytical tools and the archives that would allow them to do so comprehensively. The traditional owners of the land are, in various ways and through various institutions, maintaining their knowledge of and their claim to the underground of their country. The Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung Cultural Heritage Aboriginal Corporation is the legally recognized body for the management of cultural heritage on Wurundjeri country, which includes much of what is now metropolitan Melbourne. This body is engaged in a range of activities related to the protection and preservation of cultural heritage sites, and its work necessarily intersects with the question of what lies beneath the city's surface. The specific work relating to underground heritage is not something I can describe in detail because it is properly the business of the Wurundjeri community to manage and communicate. There are also ongoing construction projects in Melbourne that continue to encounter the underground. The city is growing. New foundations are being laid. Infrastructure is being extended and deepened. Each major construction project in the CBD creates the conditions for encountering what earlier construction encountered. Whether those encounters are now being handled differently from how they were handled in the 1880s is something I cannot verify with confidence. The cultural and regulatory environment around construction and cultural heritage in Victoria has changed significantly in recent decades. The Aboriginal Heritage Act 2006 and its successor legislation create legal requirements for cultural heritage management in construction contexts that did not exist in the 19th century. But whether those requirements are being applied in ways that would allow the proper investigation of underground heritage features in the CBD is a question that I cannot answer. What I can say is that the conditions for a genuine reckoning with what lies beneath Melbourne are more present now than at any previous point in the history of this city. The technology exists to investigate without destruction. The legal framework, imperfect as it is, provides some protection for what might be found. The cultural authority of Aboriginal Australians in the management of heritage on their country has been formally, if inadequately, recognised. And the broader intellectual climate, in Australia and globally, is more open than it has ever been to the possibility that the pre-colonial world was more complex and more connected than the colonial project needed to believe. The reckoning has not happened yet, but the conditions for it are gathering. And the story of Melbourne's underground, which has been told in fragments for more than 150 years, is waiting for the moment when it can be told whole. I want to spend a few moments on the international context of this reckoning, because Melbourne is not alone in facing this question. The confrontation between official historical narratives and the evidence of a more complex pre-colonial world is happening in many places simultaneously, and the outcomes of those confrontations in other contexts are beginning to create space for the same confrontation to occur in Australia. In North America, the ongoing repatriation of Indigenous artifacts and remains under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act has begun, slowly and unevenly, to shift the relationship between institutional archaeology and Indigenous communities. The legal recognition of Indigenous sovereignty over cultural heritage in various North American jurisdictions has created some precedents for what genuine partnership between Western academic methods and Indigenous knowledge systems might look like. These precedents are not perfect, and they are often contested, but they exist, and they point in a direction that Australia has not yet fully followed. In South America, the recognition of the astronomical sophistication of the Nazca lines, the hydrological engineering of the Amazonian raised fields, and the complexity of the road systems of the Inca Empire has required significant revisions to the conventional picture of pre-Columbian civilization. Those revisions were resisted. They were argued against on the basis of the existing evidence base, which was precisely the evidence base that had not been looking for these things. When the looking began, properly, and with the right tools, the evidence was found, and the picture changed. In Africa, the recognition of the stone-walled enclosures of Zimbabwe, which were for most of the colonial period attributed to ancient traders or to any culture other than the indigenous people who actually built them, as the work of the indigenous Shona people is a cautionary tale about what institutional resistance to inconvenient evidence looks like in the long run. The Zimbabwe enclosures were built by Africans. It took most of the 20th century for mainstream archaeology to fully accept this, against a background of colonial ideology that made it politically convenient to attribute them to non-African builders. The ideology eventually gave way to the evidence, but it took time, and it required sustained advocacy against powerful institutional interests. Melbourne's underground is a smaller story than any of those, but it rhymes with all of them. The pattern of discovery and dismissal, of evidence and suppression, of inconvenient truth and institutional management is the same pattern applied to a different set of facts in a different city. And the resolution of those other stories suggests what the resolution of Melbourne's story might eventually look like. A recognition, eventually, that the evidence was real, that the suppression was real, and that the full story of this place is more interesting and more significant than the incomplete version that has been maintained by the official record. That full story, when it is told, will not diminish what Melbourne is. A city of 5 million people, of extraordinary cultural diversity and energy, of world-class institutions and remarkable urban life. A city that has been, by many measures, one of the great success stories of modern urbanism. None of that changes, but the full story of Melbourne will add to it the depth of what came before. The knowledge that this place was known and used and cared for by people who understood it in ways that we are only beginning to appreciate. The recognition that what is beneath the streets is not just utility infrastructure and foundation material, but a layer of human significance that predates and underlies everything built above it. The understanding that Melbourne is not built on a blank slate but on a story, a long, complex, multi-layered story whose oldest and deepest chapters are still waiting to be read. I find that understanding not diminishing but enriching, not threatening but enlarging. It makes Melbourne a bigger place than the official record allows it to be. A place with more history, more depth, more connection to the ancient world than the city's founders wanted to acknowledge. A place where the ground itself holds knowledge that the surface life of the city has not yet learned to access. That is where I want to leave this story. Not with a definitive conclusion, because the evidence doesn't support one and honesty doesn't allow one, but with the sense of what this story is pointing toward. A richer, deeper, more honest understanding of a place that has been living for nearly 2 centuries, with a significant part of its own story buried beneath it. The buried thing is still there. The knowledge of it persists. The tools to access it exist. And the conditions for a genuine confrontation with what it means are, slowly and unevenly, gathering. Not today. Not in the immediate future. But coming. Beneath Melbourne lies something sealed. It was buried, and the reasons for the burying were never fully explained. The not explaining was itself a form of communication, a communication that said, "Stop looking." The story of Melbourne's underground is partly a story of people who didn't stop looking, who kept the question alive across a century and a half of official silence, who preserved the fragments and the accounts and the memories that constitute the evidence for something real beneath the streets of a city that was built on the premise that there was nothing there worth looking at. Those people, whoever they are and wherever they are, including you, listening to this in the dark, are part of the reason that the question is still alive. Questions stay alive when people keep asking them, and the question of what lies beneath Melbourne, and who put it there, and why it was buried, and what it means, is a question that deserves to be asked. So keep asking it, keep looking, keep following the evidence wherever it goes, even when it goes somewhere that the official record says it shouldn't. The underground is patient. It has been waiting for a long time already. And the people who built it, whoever they were, built it to last. Whatever is down there is still down there. And the story of what it is, and what it means is not finished yet. It is, in the deepest sense, just beginning. I want to take you somewhere specific one more time before we close. Not underground, up. I want to take you to the roof of a building on the corner of Collins and Swanston Streets in Melbourne's central business district. On a clear night, when the air is cold and the city is quiet and the stars are visible above the ambient glow of the urban light, I want to ask you to look down. From that height, in that quiet, the city looks very different. The grid of streets is visible, Hoddle's lines running straight and clean in both directions, intersecting at right angles in the way that all such grids do. The trams are parked for the night. The office buildings are mostly dark, their lobbies lit, but their floors empty. The laneways that cut through the blocks are narrow shadows. And the whole of it, the whole grid, sits on the ground, the way all cities sit on the ground. Heavily, completely, as though it has always been there, and always will be. It hasn't always been there. That is the knowledge that changes the view from the roof. Beneath the grid, beneath the foundations of the buildings, beneath the utility corridors and the city loop tunnels, and the basement car parks, and the service infrastructure of a modern metropolis, there is ground that was here before any of this was. Ground that was walked on by people whose names we don't know and whose stories we haven't told. Ground that was understood by those people as a specific kind of place. A place of significance. A place of access. A place where the surface of the world and the interior of the world come close enough together that the distance can be crossed. Those people went underground here. They built spaces in the dark. They created passages that went from one place to another through the earth rather than over it. And they invested those passages with the meaning that their tradition told them the underground held. That meaning is still there. It is sealed, inaccessible, covered by concrete and steel and the weight of a city that was built on top of it. But it persists, in the earth, in the knowledge of the people who have always known it was there, in the fragments of accounts that were written down by people who found it and were told not to talk about it, in the questions that remain open after a century and a half of official silence. The stars above the city are the same stars that the people who built what is beneath it looked at. The Pleiades, the Southern Cross, the Milky Way, if you can see it through the light. They navigated by those stars, whether they were the Aboriginal custodians of the land moving through their country, or the maritime visitors who sailed toward this coast from the north and west. The stars were the map of the surface world, and the underground was the map of something else, something below the surface, something interior, something that the stars above and the passages below were both pointing toward, in different registers, from different directions. I don't know what that something is. I don't think any of us do, with the knowledge available to us now. But I think the people who built what is beneath Melbourne knew. I think the Wurundjeri elders who maintain the knowledge of what is in the country's underground know, in their way and in their language. And I think the evidence, patiently assembled over a long time by people who couldn't stop asking the question, is slowly revealing an outline of an answer. The underground of Melbourne is a mystery. Not a manufactured mystery, not a mystery created for entertainment, but a real one. A genuine set of unknowns that sit beneath a real city, documented in real fragments of evidence, and pointing toward a real truth about this place and its history that has not yet been fully told. Let me walk through the main threads of what we've covered, not to summarize them in a way that reduces them, but to hold them together one more time before the end. We've talked about the colonial record of underground discoveries in Melbourne, beginning in the 1840s and continuing through the 20th century. A pattern of discovery, suppression, and official non-response that is too consistent and too widespread to be explained by administrative convenience alone. Workers found things. The authorities came and looked. The instruction was the same: seal it and move on. No investigation, no documentation, no inquiry, just closure. We've talked about the geological and hydrological character of Melbourne's subsurface, which is such that pre-colonial structures, if they were built, could have survived in recognizable form into the colonial period and beyond. The accounts of intact passages and standing chambers encountered by colonial workers are consistent with what the local geology would allow. We've talked about the oral traditions of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung peoples, which consistently encode knowledge of underground features of the Lower Yarra country, features that are regarded as significant, old, and requiring caution. That knowledge was not created in response to colonial discovery. It predates colonial settlement by an unknown but certainly significant period. We've talked about the broader question of pre-colonial contact between Australia and the ancient maritime world of the Indian Ocean, and about the evidence, scattered but accumulating, that suggests such contacts may have occurred and may have been more significant than the official historical record acknowledges. The mahogany ship, the Chinese coins of the Wessel Islands, the Macassan contact that is documented, and that implies the existence of earlier contact that is not, the botanical anomalies, the linguistic resemblances. None of these is definitive. Together, they form a pattern that is difficult to simply dismiss. We've talked about the international context of this question, particularly the parallel evidence from pre-Columbian North America, where similar patterns of discovery, suppression, and eventual reluctant acknowledgement have played out over a longer period and with more documentation. The Bat Creek Stone, the Los Lunas Decalogue Stone, the Tucson Lead artifacts. Each of these is contested. Each points toward the same conclusion, that the ancient world was more connected than the mainstream historical record has been willing to acknowledge, and that the resistance to that conclusion is institutional rather than evidentiary. We've talked about the specific sites, the Flinders Street Station foundations, the Queen Street Passage described by the 1980s construction worker, the patterns visible in the 1857 Melbourne Argus report, the Dandenong Ranges stone formations, the Port Victoria discoveries. Individual data points, not individually conclusive, but together forming a picture of an underground that is not empty and not simple. And we've talked about what it would mean to investigate properly, the tools that exist, the partnerships that would be required, the institutional and political conditions that are necessary for a genuine reckoning, not there yet, but becoming more possible. That is the story as I understand it. Incomplete, uncertain, pointing somewhere that is not yet visible, but real. All of it, to the best of my knowledge, real. There is one more thing I want to say before the end, and it is the thing that I think matters most. The underground of Melbourne is not just an Australian question. It is a question about the nature of the ancient world, about the depth and range of human connection across the surface of the planet, about what our species did in the long period before writing, and about what we have lost by not knowing. The conventional picture of the ancient world is one of isolated civilizations, slowly and laboriously developing in their separate regions, making contact with each other only gradually and only through well-documented channels. A world in which the great maritime cultures of the Indian Ocean reached only as far as the documented records tell us they reached. A world in which Australia was a separate, sealed-off zone of human experience, connected to the rest only by the most recent of modern links. That picture is wrong. Not completely wrong, not in all its details, but wrong in its most fundamental assumption, that the default state of ancient human populations was isolation rather than connection. The archaeological and genetic evidence accumulating from multiple directions tells a different story. A story of ancient maritime capability that was more extensive and more reliable than we have given credit for. A story of contact and exchange and the movement of people and ideas across distances that we have assumed were barriers. A story in which the margins of the ancient world were not as far from the centers as the centers assumed. Melbourne's underground is one piece of that larger story. A small piece, in the scheme of things. A local anomaly in a specific city on the southeastern coast of a continent that the mainstream historical record has treated as peripheral to the ancient world's main events. But it is a piece that connects to others, that rhymes with what is being found in other places and by other methods, that points toward the same conclusion that the evidence in a dozen other contexts is pointing toward. We were more connected than we knew. The ancient world was more traveled, more curious, more adventurous than the story we have told about it. And the evidence of that connectivity is still there, in the earth, waiting to be found by people who are willing to look. Beneath Melbourne lies something sealed. It was buried, and the official record has never adequately explained why. But the why is there, in the pattern of the suppression, in the consistency of the institutional response, in the specific anxieties that drove the colonial administration to seal and forget rather than investigate and understand. The why is that what was found threatened the story of a blank slate, of a people without history, of a continent without significance before the Europeans arrived. That story was always wrong. The evidence beneath Melbourne is one more proof that it was wrong. And the truth that the evidence points toward, however incomplete our understanding of it remains, is that this place has a history that is longer, stranger, and more connected to the rest of the ancient world than the official record has ever been willing to acknowledge. That truth is still sealed, still buried, still waiting, but it is patient. It has been waiting for a long time. And eventually, as the tools improve, and the institutional resistance weakens, and the people whose knowledge of what is there is most fundamental and most ancient are finally given the authority and the partnership they deserve, eventually, the sealing will be undone. Not all at once, not easily, but undone. And when it is, Melbourne will know itself more fully. Australia will understand its own history more honestly. And the ancient world will prove, one more time, that it was always larger and stranger and more wonderful than we were willing to believe. That is where this story ends. Not with an answer, but with an opening. Not with a conclusion, but with a question that is more fully alive than it was before we started. What is beneath Melbourne? We don't know. Not yet. But we know it's real. We know it's old. We know it was built with intention. We know it was sealed with intention. We know that the people who have the deepest relationship with the land know that it is there. And we know that the tools and the conditions to find out more are slowly and, for the first time, becoming available. The underground waits. The story continues. And somewhere beneath the ordinary streets of an extraordinary city, in the dark and the silence and the patience of the deep earth, something remains that was placed there a very long time ago by people who understood this place in ways we are only just beginning to imagine. If you're still listening, still with me in the dark, still letting these questions settle into the quiet space of late night, then you are part of the reason this story stays alive. Every person who asks the question keeps the question open, and open questions eventually find their answers. Maybe not tonight, maybe not soon, but eventually, in the Earth's own time, which is longer and slower and more patient than anything we've built on top of it. Rest now. Let the image of the city settle into the image of what's beneath it, the streets above, the sealed passages below. The long, slow accumulation of evidence that something is there and something matters about what it is. Let that settle. Let it be with you in the quiet. You don't have to know the answer tonight. The earth is holding it, and when the time comes to know, the knowing will be there. If this journey through the underground of Melbourne has been worth spending your time with, you can gently tap the like button. It helps these stories reach the people who need them. If you want more of this kind of exploration, of the strange and the buried and the not yet understood, consider subscribing. I make these videos for the people who lie awake wondering about the things that aren't in the history books, the things that are in the earth, the things that are in the dark. If that's you, I'll see you in the next one. Where are you right now? What time is it where you are? Leave it in the comments. Someone is always listening. That's the one thing, in a story full of uncertainty, that I know for sure. Good night. And rest easy above whatever lies beneath you. Because something lies beneath all of us. The question is whether we're willing to look. There is something I've been holding back. Not because it isn't relevant, but because it requires a particular kind of care in the telling, and I wanted to get to a certain point in this story before introducing it. We're at that point now. In 2008, a groundwater management survey was conducted across a section of Melbourne's central business district as part of a broader assessment of subsurface conditions in preparation for a proposed infrastructure project. The survey used a combination of borehole data and downhole geophysical logging to characterize the subsurface conditions across a corridor roughly following the route of one of the proposed new underground rail connections. The survey was a routine engineering document produced by a commercial geophysical firm under contract to a state government agency, and it was not intended for public circulation. It was, by its nature, technical and dry, and concerned primarily with things like soil-bearing capacity and groundwater flow rates and the presence of potential obstructions to tunneling. Within the technical data of this survey, compiled by engineers and geophysicists whose job was to characterize the underground rather than interpret its history, there are anomalies. Anomalies that the survey notes and categorizes as features of uncertain origin requiring further investigation before tunneling commences, and that, as far as any follow-up documentation in the public record suggests, were not further investigated, but were simply incorporated as risk factors in the engineering assessment. The anomalies include, at specific locations along the survey corridor, void detection hits at depths that are consistent with the depths reported in historical accounts of underground discoveries in the same general area. Void detection hits are essentially what they sound like: signals in the geophysical data indicating the presence of empty or partially empty spaces below the surface. They can be caused by many things: collapsed drainage infrastructure, old basements, natural voids in sedimentary rock, but they can also be caused by deliberately constructed underground spaces. What the survey cannot tell us, from its data alone, is what created the voids. That would require a different kind of investigation, one that was not conducted. But the locations of the anomalies in the 2008 survey are consistent with the locations of the historical reports of underground discoveries. Consistent in a way that is specific enough to be notable, if you are looking for that consistency. I am aware that this is a very careful formulation. Consistent, if you are looking. The criticism that any such formulation is susceptible to is obvious. I am looking for the pattern, and therefore I see it. The confirmation bias critique is fair, and should be taken seriously, but it should also be applied to the other side of the equation. The consistent decision not to look, not to investigate the anomalies identified in engineering surveys, not to follow up on the historical reports of underground discoveries, is also a form of bias. A bias toward not finding, toward keeping the official record unencumbered by the complexity that a serious investigation might introduce. Both biases are real. The question of which is more operative in any specific case can only be answered by actually looking, by conducting the investigation that has consistently not been conducted, by bringing the geophysical survey data and the historical accounts and the traditional knowledge into a common framework and asking what the full picture shows. That investigation has not been done. I cannot tell you what it would find, but I can tell you that the data for it exists, that the accounts for it exist, that the knowledge for it exists, and that what is preventing it is not the absence of evidence, but the absence of will. Let me take you one more time to a specific moment. A moment that I think captures the essential character of this story in a way that abstractions cannot. It is 1891. Melbourne is at the height of its land boom. The city is building at a pace and a scale that it will not surpass for decades. On a building site in the central CBD, on a cold autumn morning, a crew of laborers is digging the foundation trench for a new building. They hit something hard. They dig around it. It is the edge of a stone wall. They follow it. It continues. They find a passage. They follow that. It goes somewhere. One of the workers, a young man who has come from Ireland to try his luck in the colony, is curious in the way that young men are curious. He wants to know where it goes. He takes a lantern and walks a few meters along the passage. The stone is smooth and regular. The ceiling is low above him. It is quiet in the way that underground places are quiet, a quality of silence that is different from surface silence, heavier, more complete. He can hear his own breathing. He can hear the lantern. He can hear nothing else. He turns around. He comes back. He doesn't say much about what he saw, because the foreman is already calling for Phil and the site engineer is already on his way. He watches the passage being filled. He watches the work continue above it. He thinks about it in the way that people think about things they can't explain for a long time afterward. He doesn't write anything down. He doesn't have a journal. He tells his wife about it one evening, and she listens and then moves on to something else, because there is dinner to prepare and children to attend to, and the world is full of things that need doing. He tells a friend at the pub once, and the friend shrugs and says that Melbourne is full of old tunnels, and what does it matter? He lets it go. He lives his life. He dies in 1923, having never spoken of it again in any recorded context. But he was there. He walked a few meters into something that was built by someone who came before him by a very long time, and he stood in it, briefly, and he breathed the air of it, and he heard the silence of it, and he came back out and watched it be sealed. And that experience, even though it was never recorded, even though it generated no documentation and created no follow-up and added nothing to the official record of the city that was being built above it, was real. It happened. He was there. Something was there. That young man from Ireland is one of many, not famous, not documented, just present, just briefly in contact with something old and sealed, and then gone, back to the surface, back to the work, back to the life that the city of Melbourne was offering to people who came to build it. The encounter didn't change his life in any visible way. He built the city, he lived in it, he raised children in it, and beneath him, for the rest of his life, the thing he had briefly entered continued to exist, sealed away by the work of his own hands. I think about that young man a lot, about the multiplicity of such moments across a century and more of construction in a growing city, in which an ordinary person came into contact with something extraordinary and was immediately instructed to put it aside and continue. The cumulative weight of all those moments of encounter and dismissal is, in a way, the real story of Melbourne's underground, not the grand narrative of suppression and institutional management. The small individual moments of contact, each one unremarked and unrecorded, each one a brief meeting between the present and something much older, each one sealed over by the next shovelful of fill. Those moments are why the question persists. Not because of researchers or journalists or anyone who has tried to tell this story formally, but because of the people who were there, who stood in the passages, briefly, in the dark, and felt something, and came back out and went on with their lives, but never quite forgot what it felt like to be, for a moment, in the presence of something that had been in the earth for a very long time. The earth holds what it holds. The passages hold what they hold. The story of Melbourne's underground is the story of what happens when human institutions confront evidence that complicates the stories they need to tell about themselves and choose, consistently, to look away rather than look closer. But looking away has costs. The cost, in this case, has been paid mostly by the people whose relationship with this land is oldest and most fundamental. The Aboriginal custodians whose country's underground has been sealed by the city built on top of it. Their loss is the most significant aspect of this story, and I want to acknowledge that clearly before the end. Whatever lies beneath Melbourne, whoever built it, and whatever it means, it is part of a country that belongs, in the most fundamental sense, to the people who have been in relationship with it for the longest time. The investigation of what is there, if it ever happens, will need to be led by those people, conducted in partnership with them, and returned to them in a form that serves their ongoing relationship with their country, not as archaeological data for a museum, not as evidence for a history book, as part of the living story of a living relationship between a people and a place. That is what proper investigation would look like. That is what the evidence, if it is ever properly examined, deserves. And that is the kind of understanding, finally and honestly earned, that the city of Melbourne has been avoiding for 150 years. The avoiding is not finished. The question is still open. But the conditions for a different kind of engagement are more present than they have ever been. And the story, for all the length and complexity it has taken in this telling, is, in the most important sense, not finished. It is waiting, in the earth, in the knowledge of the people who know, in the accumulating evidence of those who keep looking, in the open question that refuses, despite everything, to close. What is beneath Melbourne? The answer is there. It has been there for a very long time. And the only thing that needs to change for the answer to become available is the willingness to look, honestly, without predetermined conclusions, in partnership with the people whose country it is, with the full weight of the available tools and the accumulated evidence and the open curiosity that all genuine inquiry requires. That willingness is what this story has been a small argument for, not a conclusion, an argument for looking, an argument for taking the question seriously, an argument for the possibility that beneath one of the great modern cities of the world, there is something that the modern world has not yet found the courage to face directly. Maybe that courage is closer than it has ever been. And maybe the fact that you've spent this time with this story, following these threads into the dark, is part of how that courage builds. One person at a time, one question at a time, one careful, patient, honest look at what the evidence actually says, instead of what the official record has insisted on saying for a very long time. The underground waits. The story continues. And the truth, whatever it is still there. Beneath Melbourne. Sealed, but not gone. I want to leave you with one last image before you drift. Not a dramatic image, a quiet one. It is night in Melbourne. The city is settling into itself, the way cities do in the small hours. The trams have stopped, the lights in the office towers are mostly off. The streets, which will in a few hours be full of commuters and delivery trucks and the ordinary noise of urban life, are quiet now. There is a light rain, the kind that Melbourne does so well, soft and horizontal and slightly indifferent, the rain of a city at the edge of the Southern Ocean. Beneath the rain, beneath the streets, beneath the foundations and the tunnels and the service corridors and the deep utility infrastructure of a modern city. Beneath all of that, the passages are there, sealed and silent, in the dark that has not been disturbed since the last person to seal them in the 1880s completed their work and went back up to the surface. Nothing moves down there. The air is still. The temperature is constant. The way underground temperatures always are, unchanged by the rain above or the city above or the centuries that have passed since the last person was in those spaces for any purpose that was their own rather than the purpose of filling them in and forgetting them. But the stone is still there. The walls are still standing, in the places where the geology has been kind. The arrangement of the spaces still reflects whatever intention organized them in the first place. The purpose for which they were built, whether ritual or sacred or practical, or some combination of all of these, that our frameworks of understanding would struggle to hold, is encoded in their shape and their placement and their orientation to the geography of the land around them. That purpose is waiting. Not in any mystical sense, just in the plain sense that information waits in physical form until someone looks. The underground of Melbourne contains information about who was there before the city, about what they built and why, about the depth and reach of the ancient world's connections across the surface of the planet. That information is still there, in the form of the structures themselves, waiting for the investigation that has not yet happened. When it does happen, the world will know something it doesn't currently know, and that knowing will change things. Quietly, over time, in the way that historical revelations change things. Not with a dramatic shift, but with a slow revision of the story we tell about who we are and how far back the story goes and how connected the human world has always been. That story is worth waiting for, worth asking for, worth following the evidence toward, however incomplete the evidence is and however reluctant the institutions are to follow it. Because the truth about the ancient world is always larger and stranger and more generous than the narrow versions we substitute for it. And the truth about Melbourne's underground, when it comes, will be part of that larger and stranger and more generous truth. Rest now. The city is quiet above it. The rain falls on the streets. And beneath the streets, in the dark and the patience of the deep earth, the long story of this place continues. Waiting, as it has waited for a very long time, for the moment when we are finally ready to look. Still there, beneath the city, beneath the years, always,